Welcome to the Book of Urm, Chapter 18, Mistlands. Mistlands. "If I may, would you allow me to facilitate the proceedings, Your Magnificence?" asked Piecora as he strode across the snow-covered crystal shore, bowing before Bogian Cremaran. Shadia stood to meet him in front of the hovering Leviathan head. "Lord Shadia Lom Shavanga, an honor as always," said Piecora, peeling back his cowl and bowing his head before the Scythian scholar. "I trust your trip down was uneventful?" "You were not expected, Dithriel Bnach," Shadia said. His tone was measured, not unfriendly, but lacking hospitality. "Of course I wasn't," said Piecora light-heartedly. "I'm a druid. Nobody likes to see a druid arrive. It usually means something's wrong or needs to be fixed." "Has something gone wrong?" asked Shadia. "Not yet," said Piecora, "but I'm here to make sure it doesn't, whatever it may be. You tend to take things over, Hermit, when you get involved. Bogea has been working on this for thousands of... And now she has the ritual components she needs, doesn't she?" Piecora replied, cutting Shadia off. "It's because I got involved." Shadia replied, "Nevertheless, we are beyond that now, and your function has expired. We appreciate your efforts, but we can..." "Expired? We're just getting started, my dear friend. It's my desire to see this whole thing through, so we all come out the other side in one piece," Piecora said. In his left hand, a long, gnarled staff appeared with an audible creaking and snapping sound as if it grew into shape within seconds. The bottom of the staff came to a narrow point, whereas the top of the staff widened into a large, knotted cudgel topped with a multi-pointed elk antler. He looked at Piecora and smiled with a wink, saying, "Stag smiles upon you, child, life and death. Always the cycle and the balance. You are indeed its champion." Piecora walked past Shadia without looking at him, but instead surveyed the snow-covered ground. Snow was still falling all around them when he finally came to a spot on the beach that he liked near the waterline and began carving a large circle in the snowy, crystalline sand with his staff. "You cannot be trusted," called Shadia to Piecora. "Not from this point forward. You care too much for..." "The balance?" interrupted Piecora, while concentrating on his carving at his feet. "It is the balance that involved me to begin with. It is why I'm here now." "Cynthia knows your ways, old mortal," Shadia said angrily. "You will find something that disrupts our plans just enough so that there is a cost. A dear cost." "We've already paid that cost," Piecora said tiredly, looking up at Shadia. "It's in that bag you're carrying. You think a mortal would give up their blood willingly? You think so little of a mortal's life?" A look of disgust briefly washed over Piecora's face. "All of you Cynthians are the same, and therein lies the difference between us. You are Eldar. You are immortal. I am human. I have empathy." Piecora leaned heavily on his staff with both hands resting on the elk antler. "I am not your enemy, Shadia," he said. "I want nothing more than the return of Cynthia to its full glory. The balance requires it." Shadia slowly looked at the massive serpentine countenance of Bogian Cremaran. She regarded Shadia with her large, glassy, milky-white eyes, then slowly hovered over to where Piecora was working the point of his staff on the beach. She exhaled, and falling snow blew in the air around Piecora. "Bring the blood, if you will, Shadia. We will need all of it," Piecora said. He then looked up at the companions, still huddling against the crystalline wall. "Do we have the Kerithna Aeonhetin?" Piecora called to them. "Kienjoa, Ignisavis, the firebird feathers? Which one of you is carrying them? Bring them to me, all of them, if you will." Karui stood up and drew out from her pack the heated feathers that Serpendis found inside the Iadzi camp at the Pool of Vioyen. She looked at Piecora nervously. Piecora stood up and took the feathers, saying, "I'll take these over to him. Be on your guard." Shadia placed the bag of Serpendis's blood next to Tikurai. Then Tikurai said, "Once I am done with the circle, Bagheera will indulge us with a tiny fraction of her power, and when I give you the signal, release the blood slowly into the circle. For now, please take a step back so I can check my work. Exactness is critical. The slightest break in the circle, and it'll all be wrong." Piecora arrived with the phoenix feathers and began, "What is—" "There will be time to explain later. Do you also have the emeralds?" Tikurai asked, raising his eyebrows and looking at her with his sleepy eyes. He took the large, shimmering phoenix feathers from her, tucked them inside his heavy cloak, then held his hand out again. Wait, what? Do you mean—" she stammered. She looked back at Karui nervously. "The emeralds. You know the ones I'm talking about," said Tikurai. Piecora looked back at Tikurai, then back at Karui, absently and nervously stroking Hiero, still tucked inside her heavy cloak, with her fingers. "Our friend, Serpendis over there," she pointed to the bag of blood. "He was a bit of a thief. He found some emeralds inside a cave I told him not to enter, and then, later, Karui confiscated them as well as other items belonging to her people, thinking they were gifts for her, and she—" "Dear child, we don't have time for this," said Tikurai. "The emeralds, please." Karui appeared next to Piecora and said to Tikurai, "If you can take us back to my old tree on the outer edge of Kiahalla, I can retrieve the emeralds for you, if that is required for your ritual. Had I known then, I would have brought them myself. I can't guess how far that is from here, or how long it might take to retrieve them. Weeks or months, maybe. I wish I had known they would be needed." Kiagri then poked his little head out from her cloak, and Tikurai tapped the Abrignalian's nose lightly with his finger. "Hello, little one," he said, with a wide, affectionate smile. "You look very warm and comfortable inside there. I'm jealous, to be honest." He then looked at Karui and smiled again, saying, "No traveling will be necessary, Karulavi. The emeralds are not where you say or think they are. It seems that the old merchant wasn't the only thief among you. Piecora, the emeralds, please." Piecora looked again at Karui, this time with sheepish embarrassment, then back at Tikurai, furrowing her brow with astonished frustration. Slowly, she reached behind her leather girdle, tucked her hand within her linen shirt, and withdrew a small pouch of soft, squirrel skin leather. Karui's expressively large eyes became wide when she saw the small pouch. Did you take the emeralds? Why, how?" she stuttered. Piecora dropped the pouch into Tikurai's awaiting hand, as if letting go of an enormous weight. The hermit's open hand dipped as he received the pouch of emeralds within his open palm, indicating the ephemeral heaviness of the cursed gems. "I'm so sorry, Karui, my beloved friend," said Piecora. "It was at the very last moment when we left the tree. I couldn't help myself. I reached for them without thinking. I had no idea why. It made no sense to me at the time. My thoughts were all jumbled together in the same moment. Part of me wanted to return them to the cave when we got back to our world. Part of me wanted to find a way to destroy them. And maybe part of me thought they could be used to purchase supplies when we reached Cynthia, not knowing it would be abandoned. I had no idea Cynthia was lost, no idea of any of this happening, and carrying them this whole time was a tax on my mind that I am now happy to be rid of. And for that, I am glad to get them away from you as well." Karui pressed her forehead against Piecora's and whispered, "I forgive you, my dear friend. I'm happy to be rid of them too." But then they both slowly turned their eyes to the pouch held by Tikurai. Tikurai pulled one of the small emeralds from the pouch and held it closely before all three of their faces. It emitted a soft, green luminescence of its own that reflected in each of their eyes. Gloinathin Glai, it is called among Scythians, the glass of green fire of the Gwagorbanog, Tkurai said reverently as he stared into the small gem held between his thumb and index finger. Shadia, have you ever seen one before? Shadia joined them and stared at the emerald. Mother of us all, he whispered. They are real, then. Tkurai lifted an eyebrow and shifted his sleepy eyes to the nearby Scythian. You didn't believe in your own mythology? Ironic, given your station as archsage and chronicler of the pinnacle, he said. I've written about many things I cannot possibly understand or comprehend. To be confronted now with a fable such as this is illuminating, to say the least, Shadia responded slowly, softly, lethargically. They are very real, Master Scholar, Tkurai said, gazing at the emerald. And there are reasons why Serpendis was drawn to them, why then you were drawn to them, Piecora, and why even now they call on each of us as we gaze into their light. There are reasons why they are cursed, but critical to our needs today. Shadia spoke slowly, as if sleeping, with his eyes transfixed on the tiny gem held by Tkurai. Gloinpeogharka, ancient living gems of the Fauefeidomhanin, Gwagorbanog, also called hollow elves, who live in the deep places of the world. It is said among the Eldar that the Gloinpeogharka plant these gems within the very roots of Urm, far beneath the surface, where the planes of earth, water, and fire come near to each other and intermingle. They bring their captives to the bottom fringes of the plane of earth and bury them alive. As the victim slowly dies, the soul is captured within the soil, and the soil becomes imbued with great power. As heat, pressure, and moisture interact with the soul-infused earth over hundreds of years, the soil slowly calcifies as it rises to the surface to become gems of all kinds, beautiful, powerful, and cursed by the vengeful spirits that inhabit them. Spoken like a true scholar, said Tkurai. You haven't lost your touch of articulation even as a skeptic, but now that you see them for yourself, you must believe in their full history, Shadia, as they are tied to Cynthia's history and the kindred war and Vioyen's slumber. What does the rest of the mythology say, scholar? Shadia answered quietly. It is said that the most powerful of these gems are the eldest ones planted ages ago by a schism of ancient Eldar, who departed Cynthia and moved underground for reasons lost to us, long before the kindred war erupted between Cynthia and the Hyalangorn. These exiles would become the Gwagorbanog that we know today. Tkurai then spoke while staring into the emerald's green inner fire. His words came fluidly, his voice low and heavy with meaning, as if giving a sermon from a pulpit. The first gems were planted at the end of the kindred war from the captured Hyalangorn families, who fled into the northern mountains from their homes in the foothills, and then from the captured Eldar, who chased the Hyalangorn into those same caves. This is why no Cynthian ever returned from their genocidal attack on the Hyalangorn innocents, and why Vioyen sleeps within her tree to this day. The Gwagorbanog slew and captured both Cynthians and Hyalangorn when they intruded unknowingly into their caves, unbeknownst to the entire world above, and fed them into their gem harvests where the elemental planes collide, so far beneath the surface of the world where time and reality become arbitrary. Thus, the most powerful of the cursed soul-infused gems today are the first ones born of Hyalangorn and Cynthian souls. He paused for a moment, catching his breath, as even he was briefly affected by the gem's seduction. These emeralds are such. Imagine the power they contain for those who understand and wield magic. Imagine how even one such gem could be used by someone like Anmora. Imagine what it can do against her. An undefinable lull passed, until finally Bogyan snorted behind them, blowing swirls of snow around them and lifting their hair and cloaks. The falling snow had finally let up sometime during their pause after blanketing the ground with about 1/2 meter of snow. Takurai, blinking his eyes rapidly and shaking his head, dropped the little emerald shard back into the pouch and handed it back to Piecora. You and Serpendis were the bearers of these ancient gems, so it is only fitting that you cast them into the mixture when we are ready. Can you do that? Piecora nodded silently as she took the pouch from Takurai. Takurai then handed the feathers back to Karui and said, "These will go in last. I'll need you to drop them in when the time comes. They are to be placed within the mixture at even intervals around the bowl's edges, stems facing inward. Understood?" Karui grasped the phoenix feathers and said, "Yes, I understand. Let Kiegri hold them for now. They'll keep him warm," Takurai said, tapping the Abrignalian's nose again. He then went back to carve the rest of the circle into the sand. "Master Druid," began Karui, "please, I believe it is Alakai Lathmalan that the elves call me." "Just call me Alakai," he said, smiling. "What of these feathers? What are they? Where do they come from? What purpose do they serve here? Are they truly of the Aeonhatine?" she asked. "They are," Takurai said, without looking up from his circle-making. "They are indeed the feathers from the ancient phoenix that only appeared once in the world. What does elvenkind say about the firebird? What do the Banwa sing?" "That it is just a parable," said Karui. "The songs are stories of life, death, rebirth, the cycle." Takurai turned his head and winked at Piecora while Karui spoke. "But no creature really exists that these tales are based on, yes? It's never been seen, and yet every culture in every part of the world has a story about the phoenix," said Takurai. "Ever stop and wonder about that?" He then looked at both Karui and Shadia and said, "How is it that the two Fae of this band of wanderers are also the skeptics of the world's most intriguing mysteries? I'd expect this at least from the humans or the Unscavian here. What a marvel of contradictions you all are." Karui thought for a moment, then said, "Well, the concept of the bird of fire is a fairly broad notion shared by many cultures." Takurai stopped his carving and looked right at Karui. "Never, ever assume other cultures follow the same rules as yours, young Karui Lavi," he said, then touched the Abrignalian's nose again. While still looking at Kiegri adoringly, he said, "Some societies practice ritual cannibalism, blood rites, monogamy, commoditized intercourse, even free health care for its own citizens. Perhaps there are some that construe these policies as evil or barbaric or unsavory. These little ones, they do things every day that would make your stomach churn. Hells, look at Canonia. Are you listening, Serpendis? Ruled by 7 cities that represent the full range of philosophy, ethics, civics, and behavior, with only the barest of checks and balances holding it all together. But the moons, we all see the moons, don't we? Every society across the flat surface of the world has their unique beliefs in the moons, every single one, even those who live underground. Why? Because the moons are real. It's a fact shared by everyone in the world. So too is the phoenix, although it hasn't been seen in a very, very long time. For many, it has disappeared into fable, religion, myth, fantasy. But it is real, and every culture celebrates it, even as parable. It was the phoenix that made Cynthia, and it will be the phoenix that destroys Fornartha Gal and Anmora along with it," Takurai said. "There, the circle is complete." He positioned the participants around the circle equidistantly from each other. Piecora holding the emeralds, Karui with the feathers, and Shadia with Serpendis's blood. Tukurai looked back at Venexi, who stood leaning against the back crystal wall, shivering in his heavy cloak. "You will have a part to play in all of this, I think, young Unscavian, unexpected as you were." Venexi stared back at Tukurai without speaking. "Now then," Tukurai went on, "Supreme Bogean Cremaran, your magnificence, if you would lead us off." The great sea serpent's head moved with the deadly silence of a hovering venomous snake moments before striking, but with the size and presence of a stone tower atop a tall hill. The shadow of its immense head loomed over the snow-covered crystalline beach, the three companions and the Hierophant druid around the circle carved into the vitreous glass pebbles. The air shimmered from Bogean Cremaran's nostrils and closed mouth as if extreme heat met the freezing cold air. But no heat emanated from the breath, and it was heavier than the surrounding air in the cave. The rippling air had an oily quality that glistened of its own primordial miasma of shifting hues across the color spectrum. "Careful. Do not let her breath touch you," Tukurai warned quietly. The heavy swirling air gently sank from her closed mouth and nostrils to the ground within the circle. As it slowly poured down, the snow layer gave way, and the granules of crystalline sand fused instantly and dipped into a round, shallow depression that formed inside the circle. Bogean Cremaran then lifted her head and moved away, leaving a shallow bowl within the beach of smooth, solid, oily glass filled with heavy, shimmering air pooled in its bottom. All was silent except for the crackling of the intermingling gaseous elements and a constant hiss emanating from Bogean Cremaran's heavy breath. The whole process only took a few moments to complete, and yet it felt like an entire morning had passed. "First the blood, Shadia. Now, quickly," said Tukurai, "but keep the flow slow and even." Shadia unfurled the blood jackets from the duffel bag and fed their hoses carefully into the crystal bowl without touching the heavy liquid gas floating within. He then released the valves on all three jackets, and the vials began trickling their blood into the base of the bowl. "Venexi, come here. I found a task for you," Tukurai said. Venexi reluctantly pushed away from the wall and strode over to the ritual. "Take one of Piecora's arrows and break the head off. When I say, toss it into the middle of the solution. Piecora, be ready with the emeralds. We are coming to the most critical part." The blood, mingling now with Bogean Cremaran's gaseous breath and filling the bottom portion of the bowl, began to take on certain peculiarities. Here and there, eddies of discoloration formed within the blood, swirling and flowing as if driven by some unseen movement or force within. Little whirlpools spun in different directions throughout the surface of the blood, and bubbles emerged between the currents, slowly building in size until popping thickly like the primordial ooze from the world's creation. The primal moiling intensified into a seething cauldron of intermingling blood and heavy gas, flowing in dozens of countercurrents, until gradually, one by one, each whirlpool and riptide overcame one another until they blended into larger unified movements. Over time, the boiling sludge began to coalesce toward the middle of the bowl, where a larger, slower circular direction began to form. "Now, Piecora, the emeralds. Toss them into the center," said Tukurai. After a slight hesitation, Piecora did as Tukurai commanded, and the gleaming emerald gems discovered so long ago inside the forbidden mountains of the wildlands flew lazily into the frigid air above the bowl and landed square in the middle of the thick, swirling solution. As the emeralds contacted the sludge, they each flashed bright green before emulsifying within the larger centralized whirlpool, streaking and circulating in the directional flow of the roiling blood. "Quickly now, boy," said Takura. "The arrowhead. Drop it directly into the center from overhead. Do not miss, and do not get caught in the fumes." Venexi knelt into the snow and threw off his cloak, revealing his scarred, bare torso shaking in the cold. A seam appeared in his sternum, and from within the split skin, a small, muscular, dark gray, worm-like appendage emerged. From its tip came 3 smaller worm-like fingers. It looped back and gently grabbed the arrowhead from Venexi's outstretched hand, snaked over the ritual site, and stopped over its center. Slowly, the worm's prehensile tip lowered down into the heavy, shimmering gas of Bogian-Cremaran's breath as Venexi fed more of the worm out from his torso. The worm began to visibly calcify as it made contact with the rippling air above the ritual. "Don't touch it, I said!" shouted Tikurai. "Stop! It will kill you!" When the hardening worm tip came close to the center of the boiling blood and emerald solution, it let go of the arrowhead. The arrowhead landed squarely into the middle of the central whirlpool, where it slowly spun and sunk down into the roiling mixture. Venexi arched his back and grunted, and the worm whipped itself out of the caustic haze above the ritual. The ossified part of the worm broke away and flew spinning in the air back over Venexi's head, thumped against the crystal wall behind him, and landed with a heavy thud in the snow like a dead tree branch. Venexi quickly recoiled the rest of the amputated worm back into his chest and buckled over, shaking and hyperventilating. Piecora ran over to him, knelt down, and threw his cloak over the young Unskavian. Tikurai held his head down, massaging his forehead with his hand. Then, after a few moments, he looked up blinking, moving his eyes around widely as if waking up and coming to terms with what just happened. He then settled back into his usual sleepy-eyed expression and said, "Now, Your Magnificence, if you could apply another drop of your power. Easy now, not too much." Bogian-Cremaran moved her head back over the swirling solution and secreted another sample of her breath, letting the liquid gas fall gently over the crystal cauldron. "Karui, be ready with the feathers," Tikurai said. "When I say, gently place them one at a time on the surface of the solution. Let them drift into the center on their own." Bogian-Cremaran remained over the ritual site, continuing to let her breath slowly flow down into the swirling mixture below. The outer areas of the cauldron were beginning to calcify here and there as little spikes, ridges, and striations appeared within the circulating blood. The inner parts were more fluid and flowed in service of the dominant circular rotation therein, as the emerald streaks became more elongated around the slow-spinning submerged arrowhead. "Now, Karui, place them one at a time around the sides of the circle, stems pointed inward, fletching outward. Keep their distances equal. Let them drift toward the center by Bogian-Cremaran's will. Do not let her breath touch you," said Tikurai. Karui did as she was instructed, delicately placing each large, heated phoenix feather around the circle. Gradually, they drifted toward the center of the cauldron, shifting within the currents and between prickly islands of calcified blood. When they eventually reached the center, the feathers were pulled beneath the surface of the swirling blood, unifying around the bobbing arrowhead. Tikurai took a deep breath and sighed. "Well done, everyone. Bogian-Cremaran, you may wrap things up now." He looked back at Venexi, who sat kneeling in the snow, watching the proceedings tiredly. "You gave me quite a scare, Venexi," Tikurai said, "but your trick worked out for the best, it seems. Perfect placement of the arrowhead right in the center. I hope you are not too hurt." Venexi answered with pain and fatigue, "That was Ichthyophaloxu, not me. Though it lives within me, or connected to me from the bottom of the sea, I am master of my own body, and so I command it to do as I choose, so long as it remains inside me. I am its host, but I don't have to make it comfortable. I will have it do what I wish until it decides to leave." Piecora looked at the boy with great concern. "I pray for your resolve, son," he said. Meanwhile, a column of shimmering, spinning, heavy air formed between Bogian-Cremaran's closed mouth and the center of the crystal cauldron. The strange, dense breath continued to flow down from the sides of her great serpentine mouth and nose, feeding into the rippling vortex and whipping the thick solution within the bowl into a boiling lather that coagulated around the edges of the cauldron like brittle meringue with razor-sharp edges. The whole mixture became thicker, harder, and more congealed as Bogian-Cremaran gently increased the pressure of her ancient and remarkable powers of temporal distortion. An ice-cold, circular breeze began to blow around the ritual site, kicking up snow from the ground and pulling in the remaining floating flakes of snow that still fell from the cavern's ceiling. The sound of whistling wind now came from the building vortex, and the air carried the scent of oxidized, coagulated blood and the musty odor of intensified, accelerated mineral crystallization. Shadia and Karui stepped back from the ritual and stood together, watching in awe, while Piecora sat in the snow beside Venexi with her arms around his trembling shoulders. "How little we know, old girl, of what each of us may contribute to while we live," Serpendis said quietly within Piecora's mind. "The morning I woke up and left Canania for the eastward journey to Siena across the wildlands and the Banwa beyond, how little I knew that it would all come to this. I wonder what is yet in store for you, my darling." Piecora's eyes filled with tears that flowed down her cheeks, and her mouth quivered with sudden, unchecked emotion as she stared unblinking at the rapidly intensifying ritual before her, with the old merchant's blood serving as its vehicle. Bogian-Cremaran rose up and over the crystal cauldron suddenly, aimed her head down, and opened her mouth wide to engage the full extent of her powers. Tkurai threw his cowl over his head and hurried away from the sight as the air between the beach and the giant Aeonwyrm's gaping mouth erupted into a shimmering, spinning column of time-dilated winds. The snow surrounding the bowl blasted outward in a concussive wave in all directions, knocking everyone over. In place of all sound was a deafening anti-sound that made everyone crumple over and wrap their arms around their heads in cerebral agony. Piecora opened her eyes from a deep sleep. She had no idea where she was or how long she had slept. The back of her eyes hurt, and there was a dull, heavy ache in her head. She lay in the snow, curled in a fetal position with her hands clasped tightly behind her head and her elbows bent on both sides of her face. She laid encased within a crystalline windfall that flowed over her and froze in a singular direction into jagged points in the opposite direction from the ritual site. She could feel Hero's heart beating quickly as he lay nestled within her cloak by her chest. She let him squirm out and take flight as she shifted her perspective into his. Bogian-Cremaran's enormous head hovered over the beach, and beneath it was a blast crater radiating outward in streaks of residual time atrophy and crystallized temporal decay. The air surrounding the ritual site simmered like a heated mirage, and the ground pulsed outward along the ground in circular ripples of liquid gas-time dilation. Bogian-Cremaran slowly lifted her head and gazed at Hiero, flying in the freezing, cold cavern air above, her mouth still drooling remnants of the heavy liquid gas of her temporal distortion powers. Piecora pushed against the crystalline shell around her, and it came apart brittlely in sharp, broken pieces that fell into the wet, crystal sand. The others were slowly getting up and looking around as if they had all slept for numerous days and nights. Tukurai rose to his feet and shook his old brown cloak of shattered crystal. "Now, let's see her handiwork," he said. He walked over to the ritual site, carefully stepping over the sharp ridges of emulsified crystal still hemorrhaging with time-dilated energy. He waded over the ripples of time-dilated gas pulsating from the crystalline crater. The floor of the crater was a smooth, blackened shell streaked with sparkling crystal striations that radiated from a central column of smooth, black, petrified blood, set with veins of emulsified emerald. The column rose about 8 meters from the center of the crater, like a large drip candle made from the slag of boiled, coagulated blood and frozen temporal discharge that hissed with icy wisps of smoke that still lazily flowed in the direction of the intense vortex that shaped the column previously. At the column's very tip was the arrowhead suspended in clear, solid, pellucid crystal that flowed upward from the pillar and the temporal miasma that pooled in the bottom of the crater. Tukurai slowly stepped into the crater and carefully made his way to the central column. The others gathered around the edge of the crater, still feeling the diminishing waves of time dilation pulsing past their legs like unseen waves from the sea. Tukurai leaned against the central pillar, tipped his toes, and reached up over his head and grabbed the large, clear crystal brick containing the arrowhead. With several taps of his staff along the top of the column, he broke off the acrylic brick and brought it down from the top of the pillar. He then stepped carefully through the hazardous ritual site until he met the others. Turning to face the hovering sea serpent, he lifted the crystal and said quietly, "Thank you, most magnificent Bogian Cremaran. You do most fine, delicate work." He then slumped onto the ground, as if from sudden exhaustion, and held the crystal before the others. Slowly, they sat down around him. Just a moment of rest. There is one more task that Bogian Cremaran must do, and it is the most dangerous. He handed the crystal-encased arrowhead to Piecora, then rummaged for something within his heavy brown cloak. Piecora stared at the arrowhead suspended within the large crystal brick like it had been captured within a single moment of time. It was black, chiseled, and razor-sharp like obsidian, with an emerald-green sheen when the light reflected from its surface at a specific angle. Faint veins of emerald ore scrawled through the arrowhead, and light wisps of black smoke trailed from it in various directions, all frozen into stillness within its crystalline prison. "Ah, there we are," Tukurai said to himself. "So hidden it was, I myself had a hard time finding it." He withdrew an egg about twice as large as a chicken's egg and the color of soot or burnt charcoal that sullied his fingers as he gently handled it. "Do you know what this is?" he asked Karui, turning his head to face her. "I haven't the faintest, except it is obviously in the shape of an egg," she responded. "An egg indeed," said Tukurai. "An ashen egg. It is what is left behind after the manifestation and destruction of the phoenix. I've had it for all these years, wondering if I would ever need it. Finally, its time has come." "Fire, water, ash," came the words of Serpendis into Piecora's mind from the tooth of Bogian Cremaran at her belt. These were the riddles of the Morrigan. "Do you remember?" "Spirits," she responded aloud, looking up at the large sea serpent's head. "Bogian Cremaran tested us way back then, at the lake, and we passed her test, apparently." He handed the egg to Karui, who stared at Piecora as she just caught her meaning. Then Kurai stood up and walked toward the waterline near where Bogian Cremaran's great head still lingered silently. "What must we do with it?" asked Karui, holding the ashen egg with her fingertips from both hands. "Now I must tell you the rest of the plot," he said, turning to face them. It will require perfect timing, so I need you to pay close attention. Karui, first you will send the ashen egg out there. He pointed into the far distance across the water, somewhere in the middle of the sea. Then I need Hero to carry the crystal with the arrowhead up high and over the floating egg. When I give the signal, Hero will drop the crystal onto the exact spot where the egg is floating. It will all happen very quickly, so you must be ready. What purpose does any of this serve? Asked Piecora. I will explain after we all survive, Kurai replied optimistically. He then approached Bogiankre-Maran and spoke in Scythian. Go, majestic and all-powerful one, retrieve the phoenix from the fiery plain below. Bogiankre-Maran turned her great head and quietly submerged beneath the sea. Takurai spun to face the others and said, Karui, the ashen egg! Send it to the middle of the sea! Quickly! Karui let go of the ashen egg from her fingertips as Siru, appearing before her in that moment, snatched it with his jaws. He then galloped over the crystalline beach and leapt onto the surface of the dark, still sea. His paws splashed into the water, but he did not sink. Rather, his paws left faintly glowing, rippling prints in the freezing water. Hero, the crystal, Takurai said. Take it and fly over the ashen egg, and when I give the command, drop it into the water and get away from there as fast as you can. Won't the egg dissolve if it is truly made from ash? Asked Piecora. Takurai answered, Yes, but Bogiankre-Maran will be here before that happens. That is why we must be... Look there! Hero, be ready! He called out to the raptor as Hero grabbed the crystal from Piecora and flew over the water into the darkness. The only hint that gave away the egg's location was Siru's small, glowing pink and violet panther form. But as Takurai called out, a dim, amber light came into view from the depths of the sea. The amber light became a brighter orange glow that disturbed the surface of the water as if it suddenly boiled from extreme heat. Now, Hero, cried Takurai, drop the crystal. Piecora was inside Hiero's senses, looking down over the boiling water as a massive glow steadily rose from deep beneath the water. A wave of heated air reached Hero as he let go of the crystal. Then Hero banked hard as the water suddenly erupted into a geyser of superheated steam. A pillar of fire briefly followed within the geyser that reached all the way to the very ceiling of the cavern, where it flattened and spread in all directions. Suddenly, the fire was doused as if plugged, and the geyser fell back down into the water with a loud hiss that reverberated throughout the cavern. A wave of hot, moist air washed over everyone on the beach, and several waves rolled all the way up the shore before settling back down to the water's original placid state. Karui, send Siru to retrieve the artifact, said Takurai. I'll not risk anyone living among us to venture into the heat out there, but the great panther spirit should be able to endure the elements and find the arrowhead for us. Once again, Siru's pink silhouette appeared over the water where the fiery disturbance occurred. His glow shimmered in the heated air over the still boiling water. Finally, after some time of circling and diving, he returned to the shore where he deposited the arrowhead, no longer encased in crystal, at the feet of Takurai. Takurai knelt, picked up the arrowhead, and walked slowly to Piecora. It sizzled and hissed with immense energy, deforming the air around it into rippling waves of distortion that swayed and trailed from the arrowhead like wisps of invisible smoke. However, Takurai did not seem to feel any pain from holding it with his fingers. We will need to repair the arrow, he said to her. Once that is done, we'll be ready. Ready for what? Asked Piecora. He dropped the blackened, obsidian, emerald-veined arrowhead into her hands as distortion waves rippled outward when it landed. Strangely, it felt cool to the touch. The task that is now at hand," he answered. "I ask all of you to do this for Book of Urm and Cremaran, for Vioyen, for Cynthia, and for Shadia and all of his Yahtzee kin lost and fighting in the woods of Kiahalla, and she will send you back to your proper world and time. And I will forever remember your deeds." He then turned to everyone and said, "Bogi and Cremaran cannot destroy Anmora, for Anmora is Cynthian. She is oath-bound to protect all Cynthians, so she needs others to do what is forbidden from her. Anmora is ancient Cynthian, and yet she is the enemy of Cynthia, the worst Cynthia has ever seen. She has single-handedly crippled Cynthia to its final gasp. Most of its citizens are dead, save for a few that remain in the forest, Iadzi Damhai Rianmha Guzroile, those who live and fight, and Undying Lands, the forgotten. They will not last forever. The day is coming, now or later, when the last of the Iadzi will fall, and there will only be Anmora and her armies to claim whatever remains of Cynthia. Also, to deal with Anmora appropriately will require great power, otherwise it is wasted effort, as Cynthia has learned the hard way. What kind of power? Where does one find such power that can defeat Anmora? For that, we look to the past. We look to the beginning, at the making of Cynthia. The ancient Cynthians speak of the Oan, which humans call gods, that created the world of Urm. The three orders of Oan are governed by the three fates. The orders are called Anga, Orno, and Enon. They are separated by timeless principles of differentiation. Whereas Anga and Orno stand in opposition from each other, Enon stands in the middle and serves its own purpose. Anga is ever vigilant with the ideals of compassion, mercy, and empathy, whereas Orno serves only itself and seeks power at whatever cost. Enon only exists by the presence of the two others, using them to fulfill plots that only Enon understands. At times, Enon mocks the other two orders, and at others, Enon separates from them entirely. The Druids serve the gods of the middle, the Oananon, to maintain balance in the world between the other two. When the world cooled and became still, the three orders of Oan created the followers. The followers would be manifestations of their creators, prescribing to their orders as champions of their values. It was the Oanorno that were first to unleash their followers upon the world. Norolth, they are called, and they came forth in hordes covering the world, ill-conceived, ravenous, and ever-multiplying from the frozen north. They burned, killed, and destroyed everything they could while seeking the followers of their enemies. But they didn't find any other followers, for no others came yet. Thus, for a long time in the pre-beginning, the world belonged to the Norolth and the gods of darkness and malcontent, the Oanorno. For a long while, the world suffered under the blight of the Norolth, from which goblin-kind, the vile and misshapen creatures of orcs and trolls and goblins, are descended. The gods of light and goodness, mercy, peace, compassion, tolerance. The Oananga labored on their single precious creation as the world was covered with the Norolth. They lamented, for they had not anticipated such quick action from Oanorno. They convened secretly while the world was filled by all things of evil and ill nature, discussing whether there was any hope for their creation, which they called Eldar. After nearly too long of debating the issue, they concluded that they would keep their creation as was initially conceived, but for their follower to survive, they needed to craft a home where this Eldar could be protected from the Norolth. During their search for the last remaining undefiled lands in the world, still untouched by the Norolth, they found the Phoenix lurking within the plane of fire, far below the surface of the world. They stared in wonder at the Phoenix, as it came not from the intentions of any gods before the creation of the world, but rather from the making of the world itself, just as dragons, fae, and many other mysteries for which there are no answers. This is how the four realms of reality were made. The primal realm was the intended world, but the realms of the Fae, Shadow, and Mist, these came during the making of the primal realm, and many of the mysteries that came with the making of the intentional world beyond the sight of the gods dwell in these parallel worlds. When they found a place suitable for Aeonwyrm, the Oananga went to the plane of fire and compelled the phoenix to rise up through the surface of the world. Its brief manifestation and destruction as it touched open air created a great eruption that raised the hill of Gorai and extruded the giant gems of Aeonwyrm at its top. The molten violence from the central cone spread outward in a ring, churning and softening the surrounding soil that soon erected the great trees of Kiahalla, the encircling forest. The lands between the outer ring and the central tower remained in great, boiling tumult until finally cooling into rich, fertile lands now called the Heartland. This is how the Oananga used the phoenix to create Cynthia, home of their Eldar follower, whom they would name Aeonwyrm. The sudden birth and death of the phoenix left behind the ashen egg, and its burning feathers were strewn all over the Heartland and Kiahalla, lying within the ground, waiting to be discovered. The spirit of the phoenix returned to the plane of fire, where it has been ever since, until now. The phoenix has been captured within the Emerald Arrowhead, trapped by the temporal powers of Bogean Cremaran, and imprisoned by the crystalline structure of the Glonhethine Glai, glass of green fire, planted many ages ago by the Gwagabenog from the souls of Hilangorn and Cynthian warriors. We will unleash the phoenix with this weapon onto Forniathagal, the fortress of vapors, by piercing Unmora with it within her city in the Mistlands, otherwise known as the ethereal realm that overlaps and coexists with the other mirror realms of the Fae, Shadow, and Primal. There upon the hill of Gorai in Cynthia, in the place of Aeonwyrm, lies Forniathagal in the Mistlands, the home of Unmora. Cynthia coexists between both Fae and Primal realms. To be in one is to also be in the other. Whichever realm we unleash the phoenix, it will destroy everything. We cannot use the weapon here in Cynthia, for it will be catastrophic for Cynthia in both Fae and Primal realms, thus potentially disrupting the balance of the entire world at such extent that it may undo everything. We must take it to her and use it against her within Forniathagal in the ethereal realm, separate and isolated from all other realms of existence. The task is this: enter the realm of the Mistlands, infiltrate her fortress there, and strike her with the emerald arrow of the phoenix. Shadia can come up with a proper Cynthian name for the weapon later when we are successful. Then he can spend his remaining days chronicling the history of our deeds inside the pinnacle of the Court of Willows, smoking his long pipe and enjoying his wine. When the arrow hits its mark, it will be the end of Unmora as well as her city and armies. Nothing will be felt in the other realms but a slight reverberation, a murmur or a pulse, inexplicable and inconsequential, but the fortress of vapors will lie in ruins, and Unmora will be no more. It is my task to bring you there, and then bring you back here, alive. Everyone stood quietly as they digested his words in each of their own specific ways. "Are you coming with us?" asked Piecora. "No," answered Tukurai. "I'll remain here in Baal Enater Nahaigroichta with Bogean Cremaran, but I will be watching." "How do you expect us to just walk into this fortress?" she asked. "I'll open the way into Forniathagal right from here, inside Bogean Cremaran's lair," Tukurai responded. "Then you must seek Unmora and pierce her with the arrow." "Where will we find her?" Karui asked. Tukurai turned to Karui and said, "That I do not know, for my sight within her fortress is blocked." How do you expect this to even work? Shadia asked. How do you expect us to even survive? You are sending us right into hell. Tukurai did not answer right away, but placed his hand on Shadia's shoulder. Then he met Shadia's eyes and said, Courage and surprise. Courage is your means, and surprise is your advantage. Never in all of eternity will Unmora expect to see her enemies within the heart of her fortress, within her very midst, where she is most intimately vulnerable, especially as she relishes in Cynthia's collapse and perceives total victory. She knows the Iadsi are waning and cannot outlast her agents who hunt them daily. She knows the Iadsi are trapped within the forest, for escaping the forest to the outside world is to leave all memory behind and fall under the spell of forgetfulness. Unmora luxuriates in Cynthia's final moments. The very last thing she expects to see is her doom standing before her within the place she feels most protected and safe, but that will require courage. Courage. Without it, nothing can happen. Tukurai then said to everyone, I expect this to go very quickly. Shadia is right. I am sending you into the heart of hell, right where Unmora lives. You must get to her quickly and pierce her with the arrow before she can even react. You must be silent, perceptive, diligent, and smart, but most of all you must be courageous. The Mistlands are not a place meant for anyone to live. It is a suffocating place where time is meaningless. It hangs in the air like dense humidity. It is hard to see, hard to hear, and it is easy to lose one's bearing as well as their mind while inside the Mistlands. Think of who Unmora is, Shadia. Think of who she is and who she was before she rose to power. There is something specific that drives her hatred. Why does she hold her armies within the ethereal plane? Why hasn't she taken Aeonwyrm by now? What is she waiting for? Why is she not ruling Cynthia as her own, right now as we speak? I will tell you this, Cynthia was never the goal. There is something else, something greater, that she desires to achieve. What that is, I do not know, as I cannot see into her mind. But you are Cynthian, and one of the eldest still living. You are Shadia Lom Shurvanga, the illuminated scholar and arch-sage of the pinnacle within the court of willows. You wrote about the Oan and the creation of Cynthia, of Vioyen, Belayo, and Altimari, of Rodin Halfelven and the kindred war that followed, and you wrote about the aftermath, the genocide of the Hyolangorn, and Vioyen's slumber within the tree of Shurai. It was through your own texts that I learned what I know today about Cynthia, and now there is nobody alive today that was closer to Vioyen or Ahmora than you. Trust me, Shadia. You will know the way once you are deep within Fornia the Gal. I'm trusting in your insight to find Unmora where she feels at greatest peace, where she is least protected and most vulnerable, and end her and her schemes there once and for all. Tukurai walked away, but Shadia remained staring unblinking into the distance. How are you able to get us inside if you cannot see inside to begin with? Asked Venexi. You say you are blind, that you cannot see within the fortress. I have an agent of my own within the fortress. She is my mark and my only connection within the fortress, and she will be your guide, said Tukurai. But she will not take you any further than where she is positioned. She was one that escaped Fornathagal and eluded Unmora's agents until she found the outer edge of Kiahalla. When she left the forest, she lost all memories of herself and wandered lost in the wilds until completely by chance I found her. All she had was her name, Ayanthi. When I learned of who and what she was, I nurtured her back to health and helped her create an identity that was completely her own. She is like a daughter to me, and now she awaits your arrival deep inside the fortress of vapors. Tukurai stood waiting before them with Bogdan Kremaran's enormous head hovering silently behind him. "Are there any further questions?" he asked. "I have one," said Serpendis within Piecora's mind. "He mentioned Rodin Halfelven. Ask him about his role in all of this. He is a great hero from Canonia's earliest days, still celebrated to this day, but also marred by controversy and conspiracy. Not often does his name come up without strong purpose or sentiment." Piecora said, "Master Hierophant, Serpendis wishes to know why you mention the name of the ancient Canonian hero Rodin Halfelven." Tukurai paused and rubbed his chin awkwardly. "The name of Rodin Halfelven carries great and heavy meaning in Canonia. He is the country's most celebrated figure, most beloved hero of all, and yet his name is shrouded in secrecy, mystery, and corruption. The many truths I know could threaten to destabilize all of Canonia, so caution, discretion, and a delicate tongue is required when approaching this subject with any Canonian present. I probably shouldn't have said the name at all, as it has no bearing on what must be done here and now." "But it is significant," Shadia said, breaking from his distant thoughts. "Rodin Halfelven was born in Cynthia, from the illicit union of Balayo and Altimari, beneath the 3 moons that were in perfect alignment that night for the first time ever seen in the world. Vioyen banished young Rodin from Aeonwyrm shortly after the Kindred War when he was a child, and his many journeys carried him west until he arrived at the great river now called Angriluin, before the Southrons arrived and became Canonia." "Well now," said Serpendis within Piecora's mind, "that's enough to send Canonia straight into civil war." Piecora shrugged and said, "I know nothing about any of this, nor do I care." Shadia turned to Piecora, still ruminating on the topic. "Anmora's rise came shortly after the Kindred War and the banishment of Rodin, which was delivered as the last item from Vioyen's decree before she fell into her sleep." "That'll be all, thank you, Shadia," said Tukurai, interrupting the proud Cynthian. "Caution, discretion, and a delicate tongue," I said. "You do not know what problems your words might unravel for Canonia. And although Canonia may seem far from Cynthia, Siena, Banois, and even my home, Canonia has no protective ring of trees sequestering its problems from the rest of the world. If Canonia plunges into its own civil war, it will take the world with it. Love it or hate it, peace in Canonia means peace for all of us. Mark my words. So let us move along right now and save these conversations for a later time when we have the luxury to indulge them." "He is right, you know," said Serpendis quietly to Piecora. "Right on all counts. It is good I am no longer alive to care." Saghedin Gloinigle and Fleonuish, the emerald arrow of the phoenix, as named by Shadia Lom Shurvanga, was made whole thanks to Piecora's arrow-making, the plentiful Cynthian supplies found in various smaller chambers within Bogyon Cremaran's lair, and Bogyon Cremaran herself, by donating a single drop of her gaseous venom into a small, diaphanous bowl for the recently remade arrow to soak in for at least a day. During that time, the companions rested and ate as much as their anxious minds would allow. They wandered the crystal caves, speaking in hushed, private tones to each other, either one-on-one or several at a time. In these quiet hours, the companions' friendship grew even deeper and stronger, as they each vowed to visit each other and remain in contact, should they survive the coming ordeal. Kiagri would make them honorary guests of Abrignali, and Shadia would call them friends of Cynthia. With help and coordination between Bogyan Cremaran and Tukurai, they would devise a way for Piecora, Karui, and Vinexi to bypass the encircling forest any time they wished to visit Cynthia in the future. Kiahalla would never change in its treatment of trespassers, but it might be possible to avoid it altogether for such heroes as these, the last hope for Cynthia. Finally, With the arrow fully sealed by Bogian Cremaran's temporal and alchemical coagulant, Piecora placed it within her quiver in a separate pocket set aside from the other arrows, so she didn't risk drawing it by accident. The fletching she chose for the emerald arrow was distinctly different from her usual black and deep amber-yellow feathers, both visually and to the touch. She made the saghadeen with bright green, stiff, sharp flight feathers from one of the many exotic birds found above that made the Lake of Frozen Time its home. Worked into the green feathers were long, bright red and orange plumes found from broken and burned phoenix feathers among the detritus of the arrowhead ritual. After testing it many times, she was finally satisfied with how the saghadeen felt in her fingers and knew instantly, by touch alone, how to avoid it until it was time to purposely choose it for the right moment. She returned from one of her wanderings while in quiet conversation with Serpendus when she saw everyone gathered around Tkurai. The hermit looked over at Piecora and raised his hands in welcome. "It is time to do what must be done," he said. "The quicker we all go through with this, the sooner we will be past it, so Cynthia can once again thrive in its full, ancient splendor. But we must all be completely focused right now. Are you ready, Piecora?" Piecora looked at her friends and found validation in their eyes. "Shilth," she said, using the Sienyan derivative of an expletive describing horse dung often spoken by itself, typically as an exclamation. "Let's get this Shiendi over with," she finished, using the actual Sienyan expletive for horse dung. Tkurai turned to face the water, a smirk crossing his lips at the Sienyan warrior, and stood within the shallow waterline. He pointed his finger forward at eye level over the water, slowly moving it forward as if feeling for something unseen, until he finally met resistance. Outwardly from the tip of his finger, from an unseen vertical plane, came slight ripples of distortion radiating outwardly as if he disturbed the meniscus of crystal-clear water. The ripples continued to expand until they formed a perfectly circular membrane, large enough for someone to step through. As more ripples bounced from the outside and inside across the vertical, circular disc, an image began to drift wobbly into view from within the strange, viscous liquid. On the other side was a dark, murky place devoid of all color, filled with angular edges and planes obfuscated by a penumbra of thick shrouds of mist. Within this other monochromatic world stood a female figure with pale skin and long, straight silver hair, clad in a simple white gown, glimmering with silver threads that ran vertically down its length, as if she wore a drifting column of rain. She stepped through the membrane, holding her breath while breaking the surface tension between worlds of reality. Her feet were delicate and bare, and they settled into the crystalline beach within the shallows as she stood before Tkurai. She then bowed her head reverently. "Ayanthi," Tkurai said, "it is good to see you again. I trust you have been well, while putting yourself at such risk." "Dethrielbnak, father," said Ayanthi, still looking down, "I am well. May Cynthia rise again." "We are mere moments away, my child," said Tkurai. "These are the ones you will take to Anmora. They are ready for the task." She looked up and met the eyes of each companion. A chill ran through Piecora when she made eye contact with Ayanthi. She was small in stature, with a soft, slight build. Her face was a perfect oval with large, childlike eyes, the color of rose quartz. There was something very familiar about her face that bothered Piecora until she finally realized what it was. Ayanthi startlingly resembled the adherent that searched for them while they hid within Kiagri's cloaking song next to the mother tree when they were bloodletting Serpendus's body. Ayanthi then looked up at Bogian Cremaran and bowed her head. but Bogian Cremaran's serpentine expression was unreadable and motionless. All was silent in the lair except for the rippling sounds of the portal summoned by Tkurai, and a soft, barely perceptible, whining echo, like sounds bouncing in great depths as he maintained the portal's constant strain against the opposing realities it intervened. "Come," said Ianthe, then she turned and stepped back through the portal. They all followed with Shadia going through the portal first, followed by Karui and Kiagri, then Vinexi, then Piecora and Hiero last. Piecora turned to look back at Tkurai and waved her hand in farewell, but Tkurai stood motionless in the waterline. She then turned back around and strode forward into the bleak, muted Mistlands without looking back, her hand gripping her bow tightly, while her other fiddled with the arrows in her quiver at the base of her back. As soon as they were together, Kiagri began his song of cloaking, concealing them from any threats. The soft murmur of his strange Abrignalian voice was a comfort to them all, but mostly Karui, who had developed a special bond with Kiagri and his people. Time enveloped them in perpetual stillness. The thick, heavy air was suffocating, unmoving, unforgiving. Everything required more effort than usual, including breathing. Flecks of dust and small filaments hung suspended in stasis until even the slightest disturbance by the passing companions caused them to move and flow like currents in low-viscosity linseed oil. They were now within the ethereal plane, also called the Mistlands, a realm of unreality, unintentional, a juncture between all other realms without any regard or concern for the comforts, pageantry, or sustainability for life or the living. It was not made for anything or anyone. Its existence was the byproduct of the realms of reality that formed around it, each in their own time. The Mistlands connected everything and held it all together. "It feels like we stepped backstage in a theater," said Serpendis quietly within Piecora's mind. "Here we see the space between worlds and the exposed machinations of the mists that circulate behind and seep into every realm of existence. Do you know, from here we can travel anywhere we wish. Perhaps we should pay Starg a visit to the hunting grounds of the Xianjian totems, or Apollo on Olympus, or the spirit realm of the Banwa. Perhaps Vinexi would like to have tea with his forefathers in the Hells." "How do you know all this?" asked Piecora within her mind. "I went to school when I was younger, and Canonians theorize and debate over such things within their public texts. Mostly all performative. Imagine what is actually known in private to those with hidden knowledge," Serpendis answered. "It reminds me of the scar. Vioyan's lamentation," said Piecora. "Do you remember the field of flowers that we crossed? The air there, it felt like this, silent, dense, like it had weight." "Distantly," said Serpendis, "like it was all a dream." "I feel like I am walking toward my own death," said Piecora. "As do I," Serpendis responded sarcastically. Everything seemed slightly blurry despite squinting, and it was hard to focus on anything. The smell of the place reminded Piecora of the captured air of a musty basement without any access to the outside. The only sounds they could hear were their own breathing and throbbing hearts beating in their ears. Their voices were stifled and muted, as if speaking through a heavy blanket. The companions found themselves inside a cavernous hall erected from enormous shards of broken glass and jagged gem splinters that rose haphazardly over their heads to join in crooked, pointed intervals, as if precariously leaning against each other. The floor of the fortress was like a shattered layer of ice, with sharp crystalline protrusions jutting up through the ice here and there at odd, random angles. Within the frozen floor and surrounding towering crystal shards drifted thick clouds of mist, captured during the making of the fortress ages ago. It's like she willed Fauna the Gal into being from her own contempt of Aeonwyrm, carving it from the Mistlands itself, muttered Shadia in awe. How could anyone become this powerful? How could we let this happen? We do walk among the streets and buildings of Aeonwyrm in Cynthia, in parallel with the Mistlands, isn't that so? Asked Karui. Are we not in Aeonwyrm also, yet cannot see or feel Aeonwyrm? Yes, all of the realms of reality overlay each other, said Ianthe. We entered the Mistlands in the same location as the Court of Willows in Aeonwyrm. Though our steps may tread the same ground, we are in a different place here. There is no mother tree in the Mistlands. There is only Forniath Gal, the fortress of vapors, and where the mother tree stands in Aeonwyrm, there is Palhese na Muintiru Suhailinthe, the palace of perpetual reclamation. Perpetual reclamation? Asked Shadia. Odd name for a place of rulership. Ianthe didn't answer. Instead, she strode over to the side, where two angular planes of crystal leaned inward and came together at their points above them. She pointed through the gap between the shards and said, "See the mists beyond the walls of the fortress, how they drop off. We sit atop a column of mist that is the hill of Gorai in Cynthia, but there is no Aeonwyrm in the Mistlands. There is only Forniath Gal, made for one purpose only. There is only the mist, and Anmora, and her servants and agents." Looking out, Piecora saw a blanket of white mist against a dull grey sky that plunged into an outer darkness that she guessed would be the Heartland in the parallel realm of Cynthia, which exists in both Fae and primal worlds. Within the mist surrounding the fortress, she discerned the first few silhouettes of statues of the same likeness as Ianthe and the adherent, the same long silver hair, the same perfectly smooth oval face, the same shaped eyes and features, the same beauty. As her eyes continued to peer through the mist, she spied dozens more silhouettes, then hundreds, and then countless more for as far as her eyes could perceive, until they reached the edge of the column of mist they stood upon. "Why so many statues surrounding the fortress, facing back at us?" she asked. "Is Anmora so self-loving that she surrounds herself with fake worshippers?" "They are the armies of Anmora, in the making for millions of years. She builds it one servant at a time to this day," said Ianthe. Piecora's eyes went wide, then asked, "Those are people? Are they alive? Why do they stand motionless?" "They sleep, frozen in stasis, waiting for her command," said Ianthe. Then she turned and continued walking. "For what?" asked Karui. "Cynthia has already fallen." "Humankind," said Shadia soberly. "I think I see her plot clearly now. Cynthia was never the goal." They continued through the oppressive hall without any light source except for the dull, grey ambience of the ethereal plane. The colors of their skin had become separate palettes of tints and shades of grey, unique to each of them. And despite everyone's differing eye colors, they now all shared the same black pupils within dull grey sclerae. It struck Piecora that as diverse in appearance as their group was in Cynthia, and both the Fae and primal realms, here in the Mistlands, they were collectively afflicted with a grotesque sameness, like grey, macabre simulacrum dolls of themselves. To this effect, it was Kiagri's monochromatic appearance in the ethereal realm that unsettled her most. They finally arrived at a place where Piecora imagined the mother tree would be standing if they were still in Aeonwyrm. Instead, a looming tower ascended into the dark grey, starless sky, above constructed of many jagged shards of crystal leaning into each other, like a roughly assembled cone, hastily thrown together without any thought or plan. There were no doors, but instead, seams and cracks between the gigantic pieces of crystal provided entry into the palace, through which wisps of mist, crawling along the floor, silently drifted as if lured by some subtle force inside. Ianthe ducked into the darkness between two leaning pieces of crystal, and the rest followed her in single file. They found themselves inside another dark hall, smaller than the cavernous space outside. But whereas the outer area had no other features except for the giant splinters of crystal heaped together precariously, the environment here was very different. The ethereal plane's influence still changed everything to monochromatic grey scale, and still the mist trickled in and slowly lurked forward around their ankles and calves. But the walls and ceiling were of tightly wound roots and branches, wet with some thick, gelatinous substance, and blackened as if cooked from the inside. The ground was no longer crystalline, but soft and muddy. Sounds of trickling liquids played on their ears all around them from above and on the sides, the smell reminiscent of a damp bog of decaying plant matter. Small, wet things slithered and skittered within the overlapping trunks and vines that constructed the tunnel, unseen yet ever present within the organic walls around them. It seemed to Piecora as if they stepped inside a giant root ball of incorrigible evil and filth, beneath an ancient stump, grown over by its own abhorrent cancer, incapable of reaching upwards toward a sun that never existed here in the Mistlands. The bottom of Ianthe's thin silver gown became stained with the tunnel's bottom filth as she led them deeper into the palace. She passed several branches of tunnels leading left and right as she followed the main tunnel. It curved here and there, rising and falling, and they met no other person while silently creeping through the macabre, undulating palace, cloaked within Kiagri's comforting drone of obfuscation. Once something wet and many-limbed landed on Karui from above, providing everyone with a tremendous fright. She threw it off in a panic, and it fell through the mist into the mud with a wet, sickly splat. Before anyone could react, it burrowed where it landed into the soft mud at her feet and disappeared. Piecora could see the open fear and hopeless terror in Karui's eyes. Everyone was too frightened to say anything as they stared at each other in the muted, grey darkness, but Ianthe stood ahead of them, while still looking forward. After a few moments, she turned back and said, "Quickly now, not much further." Eventually, they arrived in a large circular chamber where the ground-level mist slowly pooled from many dark sources in the walls and other tunnels. The companions all huddled in the entrance of the tunnel, staring with wide, unbelieving eyes at the scene before them. A natural pool first caught their attention, situated in the center of the chamber and filled with dark, still water. Druid stones about the size of children encircling the pool and reminding Piecora of the one she followed Serpendis through, so long ago when they entered the Fey realm. Around the edges of the pool and all around the walls of the chamber sprouted plants and flowers growing, thriving briefly, then dying, repeating sporadically over and over in a nauseating phantasmagoria of cyclical life and death. Cattails, whiplash reeds, siphon wheat, and other aquatic weeds grew to their full heights before falling back into edges of the pool, only to quickly regrow once more in stuttering, expedited animation. Waterflowers, lilies, starbells, snowcaps, and snake lavender floated to the surface in the middle of the pool, only to shrivel, die, sink back to the bottom, then to re-emerge again in other places in the water in an endlessly accelerated life and death cycle. Occasionally, a stem or a sapling would grow quickly from the muddy floor, break through the mist, then shrivel and melt back into the mud. The hyper-animated growth and regrowth of the overall chamber surrounding them was madness-inducing on its own, but there was more. Above the pool, suspended about 30 meters high within a round, liquid, oily bubble that reminded Piecora of the portal Tikurai created for them to enter the Mistlands through, was a female Fey maiden, unclad except for her long silver hair that hung around her slender body as raiment. She hung vertically, upside down, and seemed fast asleep within the bubble. Unlike Ianthe, or the adherent they met many nights ago at the Mother Tree, there was no resemblance between them and the sleeping Fey maiden floating above the pool. Her features were more perfect, more symmetrical, more unsettlingly beautiful, and more otherworldly in that same beauty than anything born from the world. No creature, fey or otherwise, from any realm of reality tethered to the world or the cosmos that surrounded it, could produce anything like the divine entity suspended above the companions, so purely celestial was her presence. She was an alien to Urm, entirely separate from Urm, and separate from everything understood about Urm. A soft, golden hue emanated from the floating female entity, filling the chamber with a warm, nourishing daylight radiance that touched the confines of the chamber. Along the fringes of this natural light and color waged the abrasive conflict of contradictions between it and the mysteriously loathsome powers that maintained the palace itself, a brackish reality where things endlessly grew and died quickly, repeatedly, and eternally. "My gods!" shuddered Serpendis within Piecora's mind. "What is this place?" Shadir fell to his knees, overwhelmed with emotion and sadness, and cried, "Vioyen, mother to us all! What has happened here?" Ianthe proceeded into the room and stood next to the pool, shining in the golden light of Vioyen above her in stark contrast to the muted grey darkness of their surroundings. "Come," she beckoned. "We now stand inside the heart of the palace, Linhagua Leoterician, the pool of many returns. You must position yourselves and wait for Anmora. She will be here soon, and she is not expecting you. That will be your only chance. If you hesitate, all will be for nothing." Slowly they stepped through the mist and soft mud, further into the pool chamber, looking nervously at the surrounding tunnels around them. But Shadir only stared at the Fey maiden above, suspended within the bubble. "Please," he implored Ianthe, "tell me what is happening here. Do we run the risk of hurting Vioyen with our plan? I did not know she would be here. We must not go through with this if she is at risk." "She is not here, and yet she is exactly here," said Ianthe. "She sleeps within the Mother Tree inside Aeonwyrm, as you know. But Anmora found her long ago and opened a conduit to her from the Mistlands here and the Pool of Many Returns. Then she built this palace around the pool and the fortress around the palace. While Vioyen sleeps in Cynthia, Anmora draws from Vioyen's power through the opening and siphons it here. Anmora is powerful. She created Fornirtha Gal here in the Mistlands on her own. But to control the pool, she needed more power, divine power." "What is special about this pool?" Shadir asked. "It is a druid pool, clearly, but—" He stopped speaking, as a sudden revelation froze his face in fear and shock. "You will see when she arrives," Ianthe said. "Wait, can she control the passage between time and reality?" "Where is she going when she uses the pool?" cried Shadir, as his mind raced to collect implications and draw connections between what he already knew and observed so far. But the conversation ended there, along with all rational thought. So quickly did the next events unfold. Rising from the middle of the pool, breaking the surface tension of the water like thick amniotic syrup, came a female Fey maiden of exactly the same appearance and proportions as Ianthe, the adherent they hid from back in Cynthia and all of the sleeping agents surrounding the fortress. She wore a thin, simple peasant dress of plain white linen. Her straight, silver hair flowed around her as if it were alive, and her large Fey eyes were transfixed adoringly on a young Fey girl with straight silver hair, long pointed ears, and a perfectly smooth, round face, sleeping within the Fey Maiden's pale, bare arms. The hovering Fey Maiden did not seem to take any notice of the group. Her emergence from the pool made no sound as she slipped entirely from the water and hovered gracefully for several moments over the middle of the pool, one foot slightly raised over the other. Serpendis was awestruck immediately by the outer simplicity, yet inner complexities of her fey countenance, as any standards of beauty, elegance, and lust he once had when he was alive were fully annihilated by the contradictions she posed within her mere presence. She was all at once a creature of immortal grace and supreme loveliness, but also vile cunningness and wicked calculation. Her aura presented both motherly, nurturing warmth and diabolical, sterile contempt. He felt as if he were gazing at a life-size painting depicting the personification of both motherly love and resentful hate, contained within a single figure by the greatest Canonian painter that ever lived. Her face was lowered and turned to the side, matronly smiling at the sleeping child in her arms, as a mother smiles lovingly upon her own cherubim daughter. But beneath her smooth, porcelain countenance was a seductive allure, suggesting hidden infatuations with danger and consequences. Beneath that was an impenetrable blackness of calculating ingenuity and logistical maneuvering, and beneath that was a volcanic magma of abyssal rage, fueling it all from the bottom. Being in the mere presence of this ancient Cynthian maiden was enough to stun even Serpendis's own tenuously tethered soul. Looking around him, he saw his companions equally staring in dumbfounded, unblinking petrification. But Ianthe was missing from his view, which was odd. Then Kiagri's song of cloaking stopped abruptly, and the floating fey matron lifted her eyes from her adoration of the child in her arms, sensing something was suddenly wrong in the sanctified chamber around her. Piecora was first to tear her eyes from the figure floating above the pool, and she whirled around to see Ianthe holding Kiagri's lifeless body by his neck. The poor Abrignalian's head rolled unnaturally to the side as she completed the deadly stroke of her knife across his neck and vocal cords. An ear-splitting roar erupted then, filling the chamber with bone-rattling sound, as Karui's lithe pink and violet patterned elven body exploded into a bipedal creature twice her size with dark violet fur and writhing fractal patterns of pink and purple on exposed flesh. Whatever Karui wore moments before, the sudden transformation was torn, ripped, or flung from her body across the chamber. Her new shape, with its roping sinews and thick, overlapping muscles, culminated into the giant head of something panther-like, but distorted from primal, visceral rage, a prehistoric, monstrous ancestor of the lion, pulled from its origins and manifesting explosively into the unexpected vessel of Karui by the spirit of panther. Karui, also called Black Lion Dancing in Low Canonian Common, lunged without thinking at Ianthe, and Ianthe reacted with the acrobatic speed and precision of a thoroughly trained killer. Ianthe dropped Kiagri's swiftly dispatched body and dove for the nearby tunnel, just as Karui grabbed her arm at the wrist with her one huge clawed hand. As Karui planted her feet in the wet mud, she brought her other hand down onto Ianthe's strong upper bicep, where it met the shoulder and squeezed. Ianthe yowled in terrifying pain as violet fire ignited from her shoulder and burned her silver gown and flesh. As her mangled arm tore away from her ruined shoulder, Ianthe screamed in fear from her very core. Just then, agents of Anmora rushed into the chamber from every tunnel. Armored retrievers and hovering adherents unleashed various powers of elemental control, as well as other agents from differing branches of expertise. Some wore pieces of armor made from boiled and ringed leather, shirts of chainmail wrought from elven metal, padded tunics and leggings, and those who were adorned in hexagonal lamellar plating similar to Shadia's raiment. All were plain and without identification, colorless even when lit by the light of Vyoyen. They wielded swords of all lengths, pole weapons of every imaginable shape, axes, sickles, and spears. They all bore the same identical resemblance as Anmora. They all answered to the same immediate call and came with the same singular purpose, to defend their leader, Anmora, at the expense of their disposable lives. Phenexi leaped into the air as his torso split vertically down the middle, sending dozens upon dozens of black, wet, briny appendages like muscular tube worms of the deep sea in all directions. The worms slammed into the surrounding assailants, throwing and constricting those unfortunate to be caught in their grasp. Ianthe picked herself up and fell forward clumsily into the tunnel beside her. Holding her flaming amputated shoulder, she ran out of the chamber. But Shadia bore down on her while drawing his two swords in a swifty, singular motion, causing a whistling sound in the air behind him. Piecora felt hands on her and was thrown to the ground as a large black tentacle ripped the helmet from her attacker, revealing yet another duplicate of Anmora still floating above the pool beneath the sleeping form of Vyoyen, within the open portal above them all. Several warriors leaped and attacked the giant Karui beast as she kicked, flailed, and roared against them. "Go after Shadia!" shouted Serpendis within her mind. As if shaken awake, she jumped to her feet, grabbed her bow, and ran through the carnage into the tunnel, where she saw Shadia and Ianthe exit. Hero buzzed close over her head and zipped down the tunnel. This tunnel was smaller than the one they came in by, with more curves and branches. Rounding a corner, she saw ahead a circular portal like the one Tukurai made for them on the beach within Bogyankre-Maran's lair. She ran a little further and stopped when she saw Shadia lying on the ground, off to the side, just before the portal. Leaping through the portal was burning Ianthe, uncontrolled blood flow streaming from her gnarled shoulder socket. Hero was on top of her, with his long talons dug deep into her back, heaving his wings in, trying to separate from his prey and tear flesh from her. Piecora loosed 3 arrows without thinking into the airborne Cynthian, before Ianthe landed harshly onto the crystalline gravel beach on the other side and at the feet of her awaiting master Tukurai. But just before passing through the portal, Hero finally tore himself away from Ianthe at the last moment and flew just over the floating liquid portal, splashing his talons against its upper edge. "Tukurai! Deceiver!" Piecora screamed, bringing another arrow to bear with yet another 3 held in her bow hand. But Tukurai stood still on the other side of the portal, glowering back at Piecora. "All for the balance, my child," he said quietly, yet she heard his every word as if he spoke directly in both of her ears. She loosed all of her arrows in a flurry of deranged wrath, but the portal snapped shut with a wet splash that dumped water down onto the muddy floor of the tunnel, dispersing the low mist momentarily. Her arrows whistled through open air and sunk deeply into the sides of the curved tunnel ahead. She ran to Shadia, who had pulled himself against the thick root in the side of the tunnel. His skin was bone white, reminding her of Serpendis's skin when Shadia drained Serpendis of his blood. He was bleeding from a deep wound in his side just beneath his ribs and between his hexagonal lamellar plating. His swords both lay in the mud nearby. Piecora knelt down and lifted his head gently. "Assassin!" he gasped from his pierced lung. "We were tricked by the deceiver." Hero came back and landed in the mud next to Shadia, shifting his head nervously from side to side as he observed Shadia's dying form. Shadia, Piecora said, wrestling with her turbulent emotions. Don't speak. We'll be fine. Hiero, get Karui. She can fix you right up. Hiero pounded his wings and flew through the mist, leaving a trail of mud raining behind him. Shadia grabbed her shoulder with his white hand as dark veins began to appear in his sunken face, while his skin slowly lost its opacity. Poison, he muttered, his wandering eyes half closed. You must kill Anmora. She wants to eradicate all of humankind. She is coming for Cananaya. She will follow the trail of Rodin Halfelven. He is the source of her hatred. Cananaya will be first to fall, then the rest. No one is safe. Do not leave my life meaningless. No! Shadia, Piecora gasped. Cynthia cannot lose you. Spirits! Trust in Bogia. He pushed the words out as his last and final breath. Piecora felt his body settle into her arms as he died. Fighting back tears and an incapacitating sense of loss, she rose slowly while picking up his two swords. Unwrapping the Cynthian scholar's teal outer belt, she wrapped it around her own waist and slid the swords at her sides. She looked down at Shadia for a final time and said, Farewell, my immortal, lovely, tragic friend. An entire culture dies with you. May death find us all in time. Pulling herself away from her lifeless friend, she slowly turned back in the direction she came. Old girl, Serpentis said quietly, it's time to go to work. But first, let me tell you what I can do. Not now, you piece of... She growled in her mind. Let me speak while I can, he said. Interrupting you is like sweet nectar to sip from. It's the little things that keep someone lingering, you know, even for me. There was a brief pause, and then he continued. I am now one with the tooth of Bogian Cremaran. It bears the power of the Aeonwyrm, and I'd like to share with you how you may use it. Might come handy in the very near foreseeable future, don't you think? Piecora walked slowly down the tunnel toward the pool chamber as the sounds of fighting became louder, her eyes fixed ahead with singular purpose and clarity. Something about listening to Serpentis's voice pushed all her unbridled emotions to the side, leaving an open place of calm, orderly intention in their place. She settled herself now within that place, feeling it flow over her bones, joints and muscles, and coating her nerves. Never had she felt such distinct, inimitable focus, nor such idiomatic purpose as she felt now. She puffed her bottom lip and blew a lock of black hair from her face as she gripped her bow at her side and fiddled with the emerald arrow of the phoenix with her free hand in its quiver behind her, a reminder that she still carried the weapon that would end Anmora and all else here in the Mistlands. The knife has a distinct stimulus required at 2 points in time, each prompting an opposing direction from the same action, Serpentis began. He sounded like an orator addressing a class of students from his younger academic days. The knife requires blood. That is its stimulus. Feed it blood, and it will step you in between time. Egriochidia Trimhiachantha, Bogian Krim Maran calls it using the Cynthian tongue. Infinity between moments in the Canonian. It is an infinity between moments on an infinitesimal scale. Things are still moving around you, but each moment is counted in lifetimes. Therefore, you are between moments, and you have your entire lifetime to do whatever it is you wish to do before either your time is up or the tooth drinks blood again, and you are released from the spell. To others, it is imperceptible, as it only happens from one moment to the next, but depending on what you choose to do, might be very noticeable to others when you come out the other side. For only by drawing blood again with the knife can you be released from this infinity between moments. Upon doing so, you will be placed back into the same time frame as everything else, only one moment later. Do you understand? Piecora's face was grim and blank as she continued walking toward the chamber, saying within her mind, "Explain this to me as if we just met, old man, and I'm a horse-loving barbarian who knows nothing of the world, and you're the wise old bricklayer with instinct and vision." "Hurtful words, love," Serpendis said. "You know I think of you so much." "Get to the point, merchant," she said angrily within her mind, cutting him off. "No time for this." She heard him sigh, which unsettled her, as she wondered how his spirit could produce such a physical sound as mental communication within her mind, raising all kinds of questions for later. "It's as simple as this," he responded within her mind. "When you draw blood, it will seem as if the entire world around you has stopped, and only you are capable of moving and affecting things. You have your entire lifetime to do as you will. Once the blade drinks blood again, everything goes back to normal, but you are where you wound up the moment the blade draws blood a second time, but only a single moment after it drew blood the first time. And the changes you made during your hiatus, during the infinity between moments, then take immediate effect. Does that make any sense now, savage?" "Ah, that is my name, isn't it?" she replied, without expression or feeling within her mind. She felt as if a certain part of her had died recently. Perhaps it went with Serpendis, or perhaps with Shadir, or Kiergri, or maybe all three had taken little pieces of her soul with them. All that remained was the task in front of her, fueled by the unequaled tempest of Sienian anger and commitment to others that was her heritage. A great bellowing roar thundered down the tunnel and blew past her in a wave of mist and debris, reminding her with refreshing, tearful glee that her best friend, Karui, was still alive and fighting, although in Karui's current bestial state, Piecora couldn't be totally sure what that meant exactly. Slowly re-entering the chamber, she found piles of dead bodies of retrievers and adherents, mangled and burned and broken, heaped in the mud. But many more had refilled their ranks. The Kari ancestral panther beast was backed against the wall, her huge frame bleeding from multiple wounds, but she continued slashing, biting, and throwing all enemies that came near her. Vinexi was pressed deep in the mud beneath a pile of armored agents of Anmora, as dozens of black appendages continued writhing, tangling, and throwing enemies all over the room, ripping limbs off and constricting them inside their buckling armor. Hero buzzed high and low around the chamber until he suddenly lifted up and rammed into the face of an adherent with his extended talons as she appeared from another tunnel. Vioyen remained asleep above the carnage, and the one she assumed was Anmora still hovered just above the pool's surface, cradling the sleeping girl with the long, straight, silver hair in her arms. Anmora did not seem to even notice or regard the intense and chaotic violence happening around her. "The arrow!" shouted Serpendis within Piecora's mind. "Loose it now while she is unaware." Without a moment of calculation, Piecora pulled the emerald arrow of the phoenix from its own pocket, knocked it against the string of her bow, pulled it as far back as she could, held her aim, and then let the superweapon loose. The moment she let go of the string and the arrow's wobbly shaft took flight before her eyes, Anmora whipped her arm straight out, her fingers curled as if gripping something unseen. It was pointed in the direction of Hero, and suddenly Hero was torn from the face of his unfortunate adherent victim. Anmora swung her arm in a wide arc in front of her, and Hero was thrown right into the path of the incoming arrow. The arrow pierced Hero all the way through the raptor's body, stopped only by its fletching, and both Hero and the emerald arrow of the phoenix went careening wayward, from Piecora's intended target, hitting the wall behind Anmora and landing in the mud heavily. No single moment in Piecora's life could have prepared her for the flood of despair and shame that hit her in that moment. She empathically felt the arrow pierce her own body via her soul-bonded connection with Hiero, and she buckled to her knees in the deep, swirling mire of the chamber. Death has found me, she thought. We've lost. Everything is lost. She stared at Anmora through the violent haze of battle as her body began to shake uncontrollably. Anmora stared back at Piecora with a strange expression of indignation before slowly turning her gaze back to the little girl cradled in her arm. Piecora suddenly felt excruciating heat boiling up within her like a bile of fire, and her ears filled with the deafening white sound of immense, concussive pressure. Within the raging tumult of her mind, she barely heard the words from Serpendus, "Cut! Cut! Now!" Without thinking, she reached for the tooth of Bagian Cremaran and swiftly dragged its blade across her own forearm. Within a breath, it all stopped. Everything became quiet, like the inside of a tomb, except for a deep, dull, slow, throbbing sound that filled her awareness. All was frozen in solid motion around her, the splashing of mud and arcing geysers of blood hanging in the air, defying the laws of gravity. Vinexi gasping for air as he sunk further into the mud. Karui with her huge claws lifting a retriever into the air as several swords and spears pierced her in numerous places. The adherent whose once beautiful Cynthian face was now flung in separate directions by Hero's talons. Everything froze in the air before her. As she slowly stood up, she noticed that the depressions of her knees and legs lingered in the deep swill. She stepped cautiously forward and gripped her side where she felt the arrow pierce her. She shook again, uncontrollably, as another surge of heat blossomed within her. The mire beneath her boots felt hard and frozen. Anmora was also frozen, her face still looking down at what first appeared to be a daughter of hers. But now, Piecora wondered if the little girl were a younger version of Anmora herself. As her eyes wandered over the rest of the battle, she recognized every warrior of Anmora, agents and servants and adherents and retrievers. Every single one of them were all exact duplicates of Anmora. Were all of these her children? Piecora took another step forward through the frozen battle, and a glow of light from behind Anmora caught her attention. There in the mud, against the wall, lay the body of her soul-bonded raptor, Hiero, impaled by her own arrow, loosed from her own bow. Yet within Hiero a soft, red glow, like an ember burning within, pulsed faintly. Seeing Hiero's lifeless body from her own action was too much for her. She collapsed right there amid the battle frozen in time. "Sleep well?" she heard a familiar voice ask. She slowly opened her eyes to the surrounding mud and violence, exactly the same as when she collapsed. All of the associated memories came flooding back to her. She felt sick and nauseous. Her head pounded from all directions that coincided with the dull, heavy, throbbing sound associated with Egriochidia Chuimhechan. The infinity between moments, the power of the tooth of Bogian Cremaran, and the spell that she was now caught within. "Come now, let's get you up," said the voice. "We don't have much time, apparently." She sat up and leaned against a retriever's leg. She burned hotter inside, and a thick sheen of sweat covered her entire body and face. Sitting on top of another Anmoran duplicate and looking down at her was Serpendus. You're alive?" she stammered weakly. Her throat felt raw, and her voice was hoarse. Her braids were coming undone, and her thick black hair clung to her face like ropey tendrils slick with perspiration. Steam flowed out from her mouth as she spoke. "I can hear you now, not just in my head." Serpendis smiled and said, "The tooth of Bogian Cremaran has great wondrous powers of its own, but when mingled with other powers, like those of an ancient, immortal, cruel and heartless druid who tethered my spirit to the same relic, who knows what might happen?" He moved then, straightening his posture and resting his hands on his thighs. She noticed that he still wore the same robe as he did when he died next to the mother tree, and as he shifted his body, she saw that it was somewhat translucent, and she could make out blurred features of the chamber behind him. "You're a vision, then?" "In my mind," she said. "In a way, I suppose," he said, rubbing his hands together. "Are you well rested? Ready to complete this task?" She slowly stood to her feet by using the static retriever next to her for leverage. Her head pounded horribly, and it grew increasingly worse with each movement. The fire burning inside her was unbearable. By chance, she caught a glimpse of her hands, and to her horror, she saw them glowing from within as if lit by fire from behind. She looked up and down her hot, glowing arms and tore off Shadier's outer belt, letting his 2 swords fall into the frozen muck. She tore her own belt off, letting the knife fall, and hastily removed her leather girdle. Then she pulled her linen peasant shirt up from her soft deerskin leather pants to expose her bare stomach. There she saw the source of the intense heat within her. A hot, white glow burned from inside her core, fading to yellow, then orange, and then red as its heat radiated to her extremities. She felt her stomach with her hands and immediately yanked them away as if she touched a hot stove. She whipped her head up and looked at Serpendis imploringly as streams of sweat poured down her face and long strands of black hair hung over her face, neck, and shoulders. "What is happening to me?" she whimpered. "You caught it just in time, old girl," he said. He pointed at her bare, dark-skinned midriff. "That is the rising phoenix inside you. You are its host, as is Hero, thanks to your soul bond with each other." The emerald arrow of the phoenix worked gloriously as intended, just on the wrong target. And since you and Hero are connected, the manifestation of the phoenix is divided between you both. She turned to look back at Hero's impaled body, and it glowed hotter from within. Strands of smoke curled up from various areas of his body, and along the edges of his wings were the beginnings of little embers igniting into small flames. She turned her head back to Serpendis with shock and confusion. How? I don't—" Serpendis interrupted her as he hopped off his impromptu Unmoran furniture. "We are now in between moments, and although you may have a lifetime to figure out what you want to do, the Phoenix is not waiting for you. We've stalled its emergence, but it's coming soon. Sooner than either of us might like. We don't have much time." She leaned heavily against another retriever, lost in her own hysteria. Her loose linen shirt billowed around her torso and hung down to her knees, except for where she held her arm around her exposed midsection. "Spirits! Spirits! I've ruined everything! Oh, Stag! I've ruined everything! Karui! Karui! I'll never see you again! I've killed us all! The Phoenix is coming, and I've—" "Take the knife," Serpendis said sternly. "Pick up the knife, Piecora." She looked up and saw Serpendis standing right in front of her, his hard, grey, calculating Canonian eyes locked onto hers. "One way or another, with or without you, this ends with the coming of the Phoenix. When it arrives, it will level the entire fortress and kill everything in its wake." "But it will also destroy Vioyen," Piecora said, cradling her burning midsection. Hot steam poured from her mouth as she spoke, and her skin began to bubble as if out in the sun for too long. Yes, it shall, said Serpendis. That is, while Anmora still lives, for it's Anmora who keeps the portal open around Vioyen. Wait, what do you mean? Piecora started. Her head was swimming, and she began to lose focus. Our time is running out, Piecora, said Serpendis. If Anmora is alive when the Phoenix comes, then the blast will enter Aeonwyrm through the open portal surrounding Vioyen, killing Vioyen inside the Mother Tree and the Mother Tree itself, and destroying all of Aeonwyrm and Cynthia, and likely all of Kiahalla. In addition to this fortress, all three realms, ethereal, primal, and the Fae, will be hit by this. As long as Anmora lives, the portal remains open, and the destruction will be unchecked. Piecora swayed as the emerging fire inside began to consume her. Hot steam curled from her exposed shoulders, arms, and stomach, and thick smoke curled from her black hair. Her skin began to boil. "Take the knife! Piecora! You are Sienyan! Do what must be done!" Serpendis shouted. Piecora could barely see now, so consumed she was by the inner fire of the rising phoenix. Fumbling around in the mud, her hand finally caught the grip of Bogiankreimarane's tooth. Quickly rising back up, she cast her gaze around wildly for Serpendis, but he was nowhere to be found. For a few moments, she stood lost within the relic knife's infinity between moments of the frozen battle raging around her. Tears streamed down her superheated face as she could not fathom what to do in the little time she had left. She never felt so alone as she did now, as each moment dragged on for seemingly eternity. As long as Anmora lives, came the words in her mind, and they were her own. By instinct, or rage, or perhaps it was her Sienyan ancestry taking over, she found movement in her muscles. She felt herself carried by her limbs through the frozen carnage of battle toward the pool where Anmora hovered above its surface. She could feel the phoenix mere moments away now from entering the world through the soul bond of her body and Hero's. In the mud where Hero once laid was now a bright, dazzling, flickering light, as bright as a star that threw shadows lancing in all directions in the chamber. Absently, as if she were a passenger of her own body, she found herself running and stumbling toward Anmora, driven by Sienyan singular purpose finally emerging within her. She leapt into the air with the tooth of Bogiankreimaran extended above her head, just as her hair burst into fire and her clothes smoldered and smoked against her burning skin. She clenched her teeth as she felt flaming bile rising from her own throat. She threw herself onto Anmora as her right arm, gripping the relic knife, came down with all of her strength into the soft tissue of Anmora's throat between the clavicle, killing the ancient Cynthian sorceress instantly while still frozen within Egriochidia Trimhachenthe, the infinity between moments. Piecora's left arm swung instinctively beneath the little girl. All at once, the fire left Piecora's body and surged through the knife embedded within Anmora's neck and into Anmora. As the knife drank blood once again, the spell of Egriochidia Trimhachenthe lifted, and Piecora returned to the proper timing of events. But as the surge of the phoenix flowed into Anmora from both Piecora and Hero, the knife shattered into millions of particles inside Anmora. Anmora's hold on the girl gave way, and the child's weight fell into Piecora's left arm. Holding the Cynthian child close against her, Piecora and the girl fell from Anmora's corpse above the pool. As they both fell, Piecora looked up and saw Vioyen's upside-down figure floating within the open portal above Anmora. Vioyen's large celestial eyes suddenly opened. Silver irises set within pure white sclerae in a face of pure divinity gazed down upon Piecora. For an infinite moment, Piecora's Sienian rage was doused into nothingness, and filling the void inside her came immense tranquility, along with profound sadness born from the end of the kindred war and Vioyen's decree many millions of years ago. Cradling the child in her left arm, her black hair flying above her in uncontrollable ribbons of smoking braids and tendrils, her badly burnt body curling into a fetal position around the sleeping Cynthian girl, Piecora hung in the air and stared back into the silver and white eyes of the demigoddess Vioyen, consort and lover of Aeonwyrm, mother of all Eldar and grandmother of elvenkind, for an eternity. Suddenly, Vioyen was gone. Just as the portal closed, the phoenix materialized within Unmora's exploding corpse, and both Piecora and the Cynthian child plunged into the water below. Piecora quickly attached her breathing shell over the child's sleeping face as she held her own breath. They swiftly descended into darkness, driven down by the superheated waters above and the apocalyptic destruction of the phoenix contained within the Mistlands. Small bubbles broke the surface of a little pond beneath an overhanging old oak tree. Around the inconspicuous pond was a small clearing of wildflowers set within a dense green forest of old-growth trees that grew within a vale between two gently rolling hills. The vale was invisible from a far distance, and one would never know that such a forest grew within the shadowed valley, nor would they know of the clearing or of the pond unless they stumbled into it. More bubbles appeared in the surface of the pond's still murky water, and then a bare, charred arm rose up from the water and fell upon the long weeds on the edge of the pond. The arm struggled to find purchase among the fallen leaves and flowers as two antlers then appeared from the surface of the pond. Gasping for breath, Piecora poured all of her strength into her right arm to lift her and the little girl she carried in her left arm from the depths of the pond. Piecora slid out from the water with the Cynthian child still wearing the breathing apparatus and still fast asleep and curled up against Piecora's side. Gently she positioned the girl so that she was on her side, facing the other way before removing the breathing shell from her face. Piecora, lying on her back in the breezy wildflowers, gauged that it might be sometime in the early morning by the sun and the shadows of the surrounding trees. She slowly lifted her arms and unraveled the antlers from her thick, burnt hair. She then sat up, placed the antlers next to her beside the breathing shell, and dove back into the pond, but keeping near the surface. She then worked her hands through her hair and shook her braid loose, letting the full extent of her unbraided hair fall and float in the water around her. She splashed water on her face and combed her hair back behind her until she got most of the mats and knots out. She couldn't remember the last time she let all of her hair down without any braids, and looking at her own reflection in the water, it occurred to her that without the braids she looked like a completely different person. She also noticed her burned and flaking skin, but she didn't feel any pain from the burns. If anything, her muscles ached, and her left arm was sore from cradling the child. Her right hand, the one that gripped the knife when it exploded, was completely black, and despite some tingling, she didn't feel any pain there either. Unexpectedly, the child sat up, wide-eyed and alert, and looked around, confused from her deep sleep. Piecora could not help but notice the stark resemblance between her and Unmora, as well as all of the duplicates of Unmora's forces. The girl looked no older than 10 or 13 years old if she were a human child, but with the Fae, it was impossible for Piecora to guess her age. "Hello?" Piecora said in Banwarese, thinking it might be the closest thing she knew to communicate with the Cynthian child. She then remembered her best friend, and how in all likelihood Karui was gone, but Piecora quickly pushed down the sudden rush of remorse. The girl stared at Piecora and muttered something, but Piecora couldn't understand what she said. Piecora, still treading water in the pond, thought about what to do next. She had no idea where they were, so figuring that out would be a start. Then she would have to find food. Her thoughts were cut off by suddenly feeling the absence of her soul bond hero, and this almost made her give up swimming entirely. Briefly, her head went underwater, but she swam back up and pulled herself from the pond. Sitting at the pond's edge, with her legs dangling in the water, she raised her hands to her face and sobbed uncontrollably. She no longer cared about the girl or anything. Everything that had meaning to her was lost. She was alone. She felt a small hand on her shoulder, and peeking out from her hands, she saw the little Scythian girl, her grey eyes wide with concern. The girl said something else, but Piecora did not understand. However, something about the girl's earnestness touched Piecora, and she pinched the girl's chin with her thumb and forefinger affectionately. "I suppose life goes on, doesn't it, kid?" Piecora said with tears still in her eyes. "I'll bet you're hungry. Maybe I'll teach you to hunt." She did a quick assessment of her gear, noting that she had nothing except for her loose linen shirt and leather pants and boots. The girl wore only a long, simple sleep shirt. As Piecora looked into the Scythian girl's eyes, a thought came to her, and she slowly diverted her eyes back to the pond, while pulling her long black hair into a knot behind her head. "Wait," she murmured to herself. "Where, actually, are we?" She thought of Ayanthi's words describing how Unmora built the fortress of Forneir-Thgal in the Mistlands on her own, but needed more power, divine power, to control the pool, the very pool that Piecora and the little girl just fell through. Wherever they were, it was where Unmora intended to go repeatedly. Where was she coming from? Asked Piecora to herself as she stood up to look around, thinking of when Unmora rose from the pool when they first encountered her. Her eyes scanned the dark forest surrounding them, but only the sounds of nearby birds came to her attention. What was she doing here? She asked. Somewhere deep inside, Piecora wondered if she might hear Serpendis's voice again, some abstract words of wisdom from the curmudgeon merchant's spirit. But nothing came. She felt the little girl's hand take hold of hers, followed by a gentle tug. The girl said something unintelligible and leaned away, as if wanting Piecora to come with her. Slowly Piecora followed, as she suddenly realized with unease that the girl might actually know where they were, and where she was going. The little girl led Piecora into the dark green forest, and for much of the remaining morning they walked among old, tall, deciduous trees and fresh undergrowth, pushing aside saplings and stepping over logs and deadfall. The ground here was soft, cool and moist, and there were no stones or boulders. Many birds flew overhead that Piecora recognized as indigenous to the primal world. Squirrels chirped at them from low branches, and little critters hopped and rustled around them in the leaves. Insects were plentiful here, buzzing, flying, crawling, and contributing to the forest's robust ecosystem. Looking down, Piecora saw multitudes of fresh fungi all over, relieving the forest of its fallen dead and providing energy back into the roots of the trees, the life cycle in full effect. It was a healthy, abundant forest, rich in nutrients and life, Piecora observed with some satisfaction as she continued to follow the little silver-haired girl. Finally, they were on a small, worn path, perhaps a deer trail to Piecora's reckoning. The little girl quickened her pace as she became more excited, and Piecora wondered worriedly where she might be taking them. In the back of her mind, a growing concern that no matter how idyllic this forest was, and how benign the little girl's intentions might be, Unmora had been using the pool in Forneir-Thgal to come here, to this location and point in time, repeatedly over millions of years, having learned how to navigate the passage between realms by harnessing the power of Vyoin during the goddess's slumber. But why? What was she doing here? She thought to herself, and while doing so, she slowed her pace and let the girl jog further ahead of her. When she heard the voice of another child, it brought her back from her reverie. The silver-haired girl yelled back excitedly. Running up the trail from the opposite direction was a boy, much younger than the girl, and the two embraced while speaking to each other in a language that Piecora could not understand. Other figures emerged in the forest, a tall, bearded man with wide shoulders wearing a simple linen shirt that tied in the front and loose breeches. He was perhaps in his mid-30 years, she guessed, if he were human. She could see that he was heavily muscled, perhaps more so than any other man she had ever seen. There was something primal about him, something Sienyan or perhaps pre-Sienyan about him, Piecora thought to herself. 3 other children came into the forest, all seemingly younger than the Scythian girl, and then a woman appeared. She was almost as tall as the large man, and she bounded through the forest with the grace and exuberance of the Fae. She had long silver hair with braids that tied behind vertically pointed ears. She is Eldar, Piecora thought to herself. Where in the hunting grounds am I? They seemed to be a family, and everyone rejoiced when they saw the little Scythian girl returned to them. After much embracing and laughter, the large man lifted the eldest little girl up in his arms. She lay her head on his shoulder before turning to point in Piecora's direction. Both mother and father looked where their daughter pointed, but then they both spoke firmly at the little girl, with the father gesturing derogatorily with his large arm around the forest. Piecora got the sense that the girl was being disciplined for entering the forest, maybe alone and unsupervised, and that the forest was to be avoided. Piecora looked around at the forest and wondered what dangers could possibly lie here that might threaten the children if she and the Scythian girl walked through it so easily themselves without any danger presenting itself. Maybe it changed at night, and some nasty predators came out to haunt the forest. Then she remembered Unmora and the pool in Forniarth Gal. Apparently she was visiting this forest every day through the pool. Maybe the family knew about that. Maybe they even knew about Unmora and didn't want their children to see her. In any case, it was clear the family viewed this forest as a place for their children to avoid. She found it odd that the little girl bore such a close resemblance to both Unmora and the mother of this family. Piecora surmised there must be something special about the little girl, a connection between her and Unmora. None of the other children showed such a close resemblance. What was Unmora doing here, returning each day? Ianthe said something about Unmora building her army one servant at a time, all looking exactly like Unmora. Was she going into the pool every day and coming back with a young child? Was that how she was duplicating herself? Piecora couldn't piece it together until one little detail came into focus about the druid pools and the general nature of passing between realms of reality. She heard her own words spoken to Serpendis when he asked her why they shouldn't just jump back into the druid pool that brought them to the Fey realm in the first place. No, apparently that would be very bad. We passed through a druid pool. I recognize those from the stories. These are holes between worlds. Karui says that only those who can navigate the crossing can safely travel between them. And again, I don't fully understand any of it, but apparently both time and place are involved. If we were to jump into the pond and follow it down, without proper navigation, we would have no idea where we would arrive or when. Karui says the narrow space between worlds is a rushing river of both time and place that flows backward and forward, up and down, in and out, and all points between. Without the power or the tools to navigate the crossing, you could arrive anywhere and any time. I was very lucky to grab the rope when I dove in after you, that rope around your neck. It connected me to you, and both Hiero and I were able to follow you to exactly this place and time in the Fey world. If Unmora found a way to control a druid pool with the power of Vioyen, and she learned how to navigate not only where she might go, but when she might arrive there, then what is so special about this place that she should visit it over and over and over? Piecora wondered. As she pondered this, a very strange idea came to her that, when first introduced, seemed so ridiculous it seemed folly to pursue it further. But the more she thought about it, the more sense it actually made, given the temporal and cosmic forces at work here by someone as powerful as Unmora. What if, she thought, the little girl and Unmora were one in the same, but from different times? Unmora was the first little girl who grew up to become who she was today. But sometime, long ago, she discovered the Druid Pool and learned how to revisit her own childhood, perhaps even before the day of her own birth. She would go back to this same time and place in an endless loop, luring her younger self into the forest over and over again, bringing each of herselves or duplicates to Fornir Thgal, where they would be indoctrinated, cultivated, and trained to serve only her. Piecora held her breath and didn't move as the seed of this fantastical narrative played over in her mind. Looking back up, she saw the family leaving the forest, laughing gaily at their reunion. But the youngest one, the boy, he stood on the path where he first hugged his returning older sister, unmoving and staring right at the spot where Piecora hid. Piecora's heart began pounding in her chest. How can he see me? How can he know? She thought to herself as her mind raced frantically for ways of escape. She looked up again through the weeds and made direct eye contact with his dark brown eyes, and he stared back at her without blinking. But then came the voice of his father. "Rodin!" And the boy broke off and ran down the path toward his family. Piecora sat back and leaned against the nearby tree, suddenly realizing her own exhaustion. Something about this moment felt immense to her. Seeing such happiness and genuine love displayed by this family on the return of their eldest daughter touched her deeply and intimately. She let the tears from her eyes stream down her face without even bothering to cry. She must have drifted off to sleep where she sat, for she opened her eyes with a start and found the forest slowly darkening into dusk. She wiped her face and rubbed her eyes with her hands. Standing up to take in her surroundings, she contemplated where she might go next. When a nearby fluttering of wings caught her attention, she turned around to see, just beyond the tree she rested against, 3 crows perched on a low branch of the path she and the little silver-haired girl had followed. Her heart leaped in her chest as she now recognized the significance of the Morrigan's presence. She quickly jogged toward the crows, but the crows took off and flew into the cool, autumnal, dusky sky. However, instead of dispersing in different directions, they all flew as one in the same direction. Piecora took off running after them. Into the night, she ran after the 3 crows until she could only use her hearing to deduce where they were, and without any light source, she had to go slower through the forest despite her wilderness skills. She detected the land rising sharply, and she scrambled up the slope, using the old trees around her as points of leverage, handholds, and footholds. Finally, she arrived at the top of the steep climb, breathing heavily and sweating. Her thighs and calves burned from the effort. Although her straightened hair was pulled back and knotted, many loose strands now hung down around her face, and wisps flew in the air around her head. Her loose linen peasant shirt hung around her down to her knees like a large sack. To her right was a flat rock that overlooked the valley below from which she came, and further in the distance, deeper in the vale, was a column of rising smoke from a chimney. A portal of rippling liquid like the one Piecora created in Bogian-Cre-Moran's lair hovered over the stone outcropping. On the flat rock, with gear and packs for traveling, sat both Karui and Vinexi on unfurled blankets, and when they saw Piecora, they jumped up and exulted with pure joy. Piecora nearly fainted from seeing her friends that she thought were lost, and she stumbled toward them as if drunk. Her two friends caught her from falling, helping to steady her as they pulled her into an embrace, as if she were the only thing that existed for them in the whole world. For entire minutes they each spoke over each other in broken sentences and hysterical eruptions of emotion. According to her friends' observations, Piecora suddenly appeared over the pool at the height of the battle within Linhiguoa Liorterisian, pressed firmly against Unmora, hovering over the pool. Piecora's hair was on fire, and her clothes were burning. They watched Piecora's fiery body, along with the sleeping little girl that arrived with Unmora, fall into the water just as Vioyen suddenly disappeared from the chamber, and Unmora's body detonated by the full manifestation of the phoenix. Right as that happened, they were whisked away and brought to Bogian-Cre-Moran's lair, where they washed, rested, and healed over what felt like weeks of time. The druid was not there, nor was Ianthe, and Bogian-Cre-Moran never spoke to them or addressed them in any way. There was no way for them to leave, as the crystal Floam submersible capsule was no longer docked within the lair. Just as they were beginning to feel as if they were held prisoner, a portal opened to this place overlooking the valley. They gathered as many supplies as they could, as well as adorning new clothes and even some fine Scythian leather armor, and stepped through the portal. The 3 crows of the Morrigan came with them, and when they arrived here, the crows immediately flew down into the valley to apparently retrieve their friend, Piecora. Piecora felt dizzy and lightheaded while hearing their story. The sun finally set beyond the horizon in the west as they completed their tale. Night fell all around them, but a large, full white moon overhead bathed everyone in a cool, eerie light. Suddenly, Piecora felt a surge within her, and she snapped back to full wakefulness. Karui noticed right away and asked, "What is it?" Piecora didn't quite understand, but she looked around frantically as she felt her blood racing and her temples pounding. I don't know. Something's happening. Something's coming," she stammered. Just then, zipping into view before the full white moon and leaving a faintly glowing trail of red embers arcing in the sky, came a small, diminutive, but deadly raptor, faster in flight than anything else in the skies. In the midst of all 3 of them plopped 5 freshly killed rabbits. "Spirits!" coughed Piecora. "Hiero!" Hiero swooped down on his soul-bonded Sienyan and landed squarely onto her chest, tucking in his wings and folding his talons in to soften his impact against her. She fell back and wrapped her arms around her other half and bawled for pure, incapacitating joy. "We thought he might be lurking about around here," said Vinexi, choking back tears of his own. "It's how we thought you might be here. We didn't know you were separated." For several moments, Piecora nuzzled her soul-bonded other self until finally sitting back up. "And you brought us rabbits," she said, fighting through more tears of blissful happiness. "Oh, I never imagined such joy lay right before me earlier today. I just can't believe we are together again. I don't know how you survived." Hero hopped off and landed onto the rabbits. He then shook and ruffled his feathers, and suddenly immolated for an instant, sending small burning embers outward from his wings and catching everyone by surprise. Piecora stared down at Hero as the brief firelight faded from her face. "What? What just happened?" she asked. "The phoenix perhaps left a portion of its power inside of Hero. That is my best guess, which, if true, is something truly fantastical," said Karui. The rest of that night they made camp and cooked the rabbits brought by Hero. Piecora told them about the family below. Karui listened in awe, verifying that it was none other than the family of Belayo and Altimari, the illicit relationship of the human Hyalangorn warrior and the Scythian daughter of Vyoyen that started the kindred war when they both eloped to a place lost from even Scythian history. This is also where Rodine Halfelven was born, which was briefly discussed by both Serpendis and Shadia. This means we are millions of years in the past from our own time, perhaps early in the Third Age, the Age of Sorrow, said Karui. Our current age is the Seventh Age. He looked right at me. Karui, said Piecora, the rodent child, the half-elf. I know nothing about him or his legacy except for what Serpendis and Shadia shared, but it was like he knew I was there. Perhaps he did, Karui said. He was very special from what little I know of the story. A brand new creation in the world, unforeseen by the gods or the Oan. All 3 moons were aligned during his birth, which has not occurred since. Maybe the boy did see you. They slept peacefully beneath the white moon that night. When the heat of the rising sun in the east woke them from their deep slumber, they discovered the portal of rippling water still opened before them, hovering over the bare rock. Standing before the portal was the little old fey maiden with the white face and feathers that they met at the lake, the one who tested them with riddles. They sat up nervously as she approached them, but her face was serene and calm. A wide smile creased her ancient face. "Friends of Cynthia," she croaked. She laid a silver chain around each of their necks, bearing a single platinum Cynthian coin. In front of Piecora, she placed what looked like a burnt, broken stub of a stick. She knelt down on her knees and gently tapped the stick with her gnarled fingers and said, "Bring home," and smiled. Piecora looked down and realized it was all that was left from the tooth of Bogean Cremaran. A swell of emotion rose up within her as she recalled her commitment to returning Serpendis to his home in Canania. She met the infinite eyes of the Morrigan with her own and felt her heart stuck in her throat. Shakily, she picked up the charred piece of ivory and whispered, "Are you still here, old man?" But no answer came. Looking up, she saw figures, male and female, stepping through the portal, each bearing various configurations of Cynthian clothing, armor, equipment, and weapons. They all looked haggard, worn, filthy, and aged, but they stood straight and proud, as if rejuvenated with renewed purpose. About 3 dozen came through the portal, with the last one bearing a long, streaming banner of the mother tree in black, set within the silver coils of the Aeonwyrm, the infinity serpent, on a white field. The banner whipped in the morning wind over the valley below as it curled forth from the portal. "Friends of the Eldar, champions of Vyoyen, saviors of Cynthia," cried the banner-bearer in Banwarese. He bore the same presence as Shadia, and Piecora wondered if he were of similar status and age. Then all 36 Cynthian warriors drew their weapons high and shouted in unison, "Cardinal, Tal the Ganbasai, friends of the Undying Lands." The banner-bearer then spoke in Banwarese with a clear Cynthian voice. "We were once the Iadsidam Hai Reanma Gusroile, those who live and fight and Andeermadita, the forgotten, but no more. We now sheathe our weapons for the final time as we look to rebuilding our home. Anmora is gone, and Forniathagal is destroyed along with her armies in the Mistlands. Because of you, dear friends, Cynthia shall rise again. Without you, there would be nothing." As the standard-bearer spoke, each of the Iadzi Cynthians came forward and left items on the bare stone before the remaining companions, carefully wrapped trinkets, specially treated fruits, handcrafted tools, toys and jewelry, and other gifts for the heroes. "You shall forever be remembered among us, and for as long as you live, you will have a home among the Eldar in Cynthia." From behind them, a small figure stepped through the portal and shuffled toward the three companions. It was Moseltwar, mother of Kiahalla, and one by one she placed a wreath of reeds and berries on each of their heads, droning in Abrignalian, "Friend of Abrignalia, friend of Cynthia." Karui, overcome with emotion, embraced the little tree gnome and sobbed. Finally, after much time was spent with the three companions visiting with the Cynthians in warm fellowship, sharing stories and swapping tales of their adventures, the sun began to rise over the valley, and it was time for the Cynthians to return home through Bogian Cremaran's portal. Piecora held the arm of the standard-bearer, whose name was Shefrimhi, before he stepped through the portal last and said, "I saw her eyes open, Chair. I saw her, and she saw me. Vioyan awoke when Unmora was destroyed just before the portal that leached her power closed. Have you noticed anything in Aeonwyrm or the Mother Tree?" Chair looked around uneasily, then said in a low voice, "There seems to be some movement, we think, within the Mother Tree. We do not know what it means. But if what you say is true, then truly my heart is glad, and there is hope in our future." "Tell me, did you know Shadia Lom Shavanga?" Piecora asked. "Everyone knew Shadia," Chaya said. "He was our beacon of light and steward of knowledge, caretaker and historian. All of this now falls to me, as I was his pupil." "I have one more question," said Piecora. "How do you feel about, well, to my people, he is called the Hermit. He is the one who orchestrated all of this, but at such a cost." "He is Dethrialbnak to us," said Chaya, "the deceiver. We know him well, and though it is thanks to him that all of this came together, it is a bitter end to suffer as we did and lose so many that we loved. We would never even think of entering a bargain with him if Bogan Cremaran were not also involved. Always trust in Bogan Cremaran, always." He went on, "But now he is gone, back to his cave near your homelands, I would assume. I do not envy your people, so enthralled they are by him, but you seem to be an exception, and I am glad of this. I look forward to a time when we can speak more on these matters with less formality." Piecora said, "May Oananga smile upon you." "May the spirits be at your call," replied Chaya. Then they embraced, and the Cynthian stepped through the portal back to his own home and time. Turning around, she found Karui standing behind her with Moselthwag on her shoulders. "I am returning to the Abrignalians, Pierre," she said. "Although they are thankful for all that we have done, and Moselthwag holds us blameless, my heart bleeds for Kiahalla, and I cannot find any peace within myself. It is torture for me to think of how he died." "I know, Karui, my dear friend," said Piecora. "We will certainly see each other again. But for now, go with her to Abrignali and find your peace. And then, I hope you can find your way back to your people." "The Banwa!" she scoffed. "I find myself less inclined to go back there, to be honest. I wonder how I might fit in, if at all. As you said when we first met in Kiahalla, it had been 10 years since I left on my pilgrimage. Who knows how much more time had passed since our adventures in the Fey realm?" "I can relate to your sentiment," said Piecora. "I shall not be returning to Siena any time soon. Rather, My journey continues west, back to Canania, to resolve a promise I made to an old client of mine." "It seems you will have a new one as well," Karui said. Piecora looked over at Venexi, who was deeply engaged in conversation with one of the Cynthians. She stifled a laugh and said, "Yes, I am taking him to Canania as well. It seems he has learned your Banwari's language well." "It's an easy language to learn," said Karui. They both embraced each other with familial love. Then Karui departed through the portal with Mozothwag. Finally, as the sun rode high in the sky, and both Piecora and Venexi had gathered all of their supplies together, the Morrigan pointed to the portal and droned. Home. Piecora could only see darkness on the other side, a stark contrast to the previous location where the Cynthians came from. Piecora lifted her pack and checked Venexi's gear before turning back to the Morrigan and the portal, asking, "Where exactly is that?" But the Morrigan was gone. Piecora and Venexi stood alone on the bare rock outcropping overlooking the valley, and Venexi shrugged his shoulders and said, "I guess we'll find out." Piecora smiled at the young Unskavian as the wind whipped through his tousled black hair around his ivory ram horns. He whipped his horned tail in anticipation as he looked back at her with his strange reddish goat eyes. "Let's go find your Alice," she said, and stepped through the portal. Thank you for listening to this chapter from the Book of Urm. If you enjoyed this reading, like and subscribe to our channel, and consider supporting us at the Book of Urm at patreon.com.